He remembers the blow. He remembers how his eyelids grew heavy on Highway 101. He remembers the darkness. And then unfamiliar hands on unfamiliar knees, and the Korean language that suddenly sounds as familiar as his own in his head. Inside the folder are documents in the name of Ha Dae-hyun, 29 years old, a county governor whom the locals have already written off even before his arrival. Daniel opens the folder. He looks at the photograph. His face, yet not his own. Younger, sharper cheekbones. A Korean face. But the eyes look exactly the same as when he was staring at the blueprints at 3 a.m. in the San Francisco City Hall office. Two lives coexist in his mind at once. One belongs to a quiet, high-achieving man from Seoul who never once argued with his superiors. He was exiled here because no one else would take the job. The other belongs to an urban planner from California who spent 7 years revitalizing the dying neighborhoods of Oakland and Detroit, who reads a population density map like a musical score. This man wasn't supposed to end up here, but he's here. The bus slows to a stop. Outside the window, it's not a city that stretches out, the remains of a city. Daniel stares at a boarded-up supermarket with a faded sign, at a bus stop with no schedule, at the road, cracked and potholed. Streetlights stand every 30 meters and not a single one is lit. An elderly woman drags a cart with a sack of coal. 2 children play in a vacant lot near an abandoned depot. The driver drives right through a dead traffic light. Daniel counts silently. Boarded up storefronts. 1, 3, 7. 12 closed stores along a 400-meter stretch. 2 are open, a pharmacy and a grocery store. Not a single cafe, not a single tree younger than 30 years. He estimates the neighborhood's walk score. It comes out to 20 out of 100. In Detroit's worst years, it was 35. The car slows down in front of a 3-story concrete building. The paint is peeling. The steps have sagged. A crack runs up the facade from the foundation to the 2nd floor. 3 people are standing at the entrance. 2 men in suits and a woman with a folder. That's the look people have when they're seeing off the deceased. And this is where the strangest part begins. Daniel adjusts his tie. He gets out of the car, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, he smiles, genuinely. The 3 people waiting exchange glances. No one expected a smile. He climbs the steps. He introduces himself as their governor. He asks for a map of the county and some coffee. Because it's going to be a long day. Inside, the building looks even worse than it does from the outside. The hallway smells of dampness and old paper. The linoleum is bubbling. Half the light bulbs are burned out. Portraits of former governors hang on the wall. Daniel counts 7 in 15 years. 1 lasted 8 months. They lead him to an office on the 2nd floor. A desk made of cheap particle board. An armchair with a broken armrest. A glass of cold tea. They never bring the coffee. 3 officials take their seats across from him. The senior one introduces himself. Park Song-woo, the chief accountant. 23 years within these walls. He reads the report monotonously, like a man who has recited these figures to every new governor and knows that nothing will change. The budget is 800 million won a year. The debt is 2 3/10 billion. 31,000 residents. The average age is 58. 3 schools are closed. The hospital operates 3 days a week. The mines have been shut down for 20 years. Young people are fleeing. Pak finishes and gives him that look that means only one thing. Now you understand why we're all here, as if at a funeral. And Daniel translates each figure into his own terms. 800 million won is $600,000. the budget for a single quarter in Oakland. The debt is $1.5 million. By American standards, it's a laughable amount. By this county's standards, it's a noose around the neck. But it's a thin noose. He's seen thicker ones. Daniel asks to see the expense line items. Pak proudly unfolds the spreadsheet. 23 years of optimization. Every line item has been cut to the bone. Street lighting. 60% of the streetlights are turned off. Savings of $80 million a year. Daniel freezes on that line. He looks up. He asks, how many streetlights have been turned off? 312 out of 520. Daniel stands up. He walks over to the whiteboard. He picks up a marker. He writes one word. Darkness. Below it, he jots down the numbers. Minus 12% in housing costs. Minus 30% in nighttime retail sales. Plus 40% in petty crime. Plus an exodus of young families. Savings on streetlights, $80 million. Losses from darkness, $1.4 billion in taxes that the county doesn't see. Daniel turns to Pak. He speaks calmly, without anger. You're not saving money. You're paying to stay poor. Pak looks at the board. 23 years of his work are summed up in 5 lines that prove that all this time, he's been doing exactly the opposite. Hong from the land department looks up for the first time. The secretary freezes in the doorway with a teapot. Daniel puts down the marker. He sits back down in the broken chair and orders all 312 streetlights to be turned on tonight. Pak objects. The budget can't handle it. The grid is old. Approval is needed. Daniel looks at him and repeats, tonight. That evening, for the first time in 10 years, Taewagun is fully lit. Daniel stands on the roof of the administration building and looks at the lights. 312 streetlights. That's not enough. A single block of Mission in San Francisco is brighter than the entire county. But here and now, these lights change everything. An old man steps out of his house and looks at the illuminated street. A woman with a child walks along the sidewalk without hugging the wall. A teenager on a bicycle speeds past and doesn't turn into the alley. Little things. But cities are built from little things. From benches and streetlights. From the feeling that you can go out at night without being afraid. Daniel takes out Ha Dae-hyun's notebook. It's blank. The former owner of this body didn't write a single line. Daniel opens the first page and jots down a list. Streetlights, done. Widen the sidewalks from 1 meter to 3.5. At least paint the facades. Find money in the budget that isn't there. He smirks. In Detroit, that's exactly what he was paid to do. Only there, he had a team of analysts, a database, and Julia from finance, who always knew where to divert $200,000 from. Here, he's alone, in a stranger's body, in a foreign country, in a city that everyone has forgotten except for those who haven't managed to escape yet. He closes his notebook. He looks down at the lights, all of which are now on, and he realizes that this is the most difficult project of both his lives, and the most important one. The next morning, Daniel woke up in a company apartment on the 3rd floor of the administration building. The room was small. A bed, a chair, a closet. On the floor, a rug with a scorched spot. A chill seeped in through the window because the frame didn't close all the way. He stood up and looked at his hands. They still felt like someone else's, but already a little less so than yesterday. Ha Dae-hyun's body was younger and lighter than the one in which he had spent 32 years in San Francisco. No lower back pain. No creaking in his knees. 29 years. That was an advantage he had no intention of wasting. Daniel went downstairs at 7 in the morning. The hallways were empty. Not a single employee in sight. The workday was scheduled to start at 9. He found a coffee maker. He brewed coffee from a packet he'd brought with him in the bag that had belonged to the body's former owner. Instant. The worst coffee of his life, but hot. Over his coffee, he opened a folder containing the administration's staffing roster. The Tewagun County staffing roster. 47 employees, 12 of them part-time. The average age of the staff was 53. Not a single employee under 35. Not a single urban planning specialist. Not a single architect. Not a single marketing specialist. Finance department, 3 people, Park and 2 assistants. Land department, 2 people, Hong and his deputy. Infrastructure department, 1 engineer, just 1, for the entire district. Daniel closed the folder. He did the math. At Oakland City Hall, a district with 30,000 residents had about 120 municipal employees. Here, there were 47. Half of them were busy filling out forms for Seoul. He finished his coffee and stepped outside. It was cold, 7 degrees. October on the East Coast, a breeze from the sea. Daniel walked down the main street, Tewa Row, the very same one he'd driven down yesterday. Now he walked slowly, counting his steps. He estimated the width of the sidewalk by eye, 1 meter 20, in some places even less. 2 people couldn't pass each other without stepping into the street. He stopped at every closed store. He peered into the windows. A former barber shop, a former clothing store, a former bakery. In one spot, a sale sign was still hanging in the window. The date, 12 years ago. He reached the end of the street in 20 minutes, 800 meters. By urban planning standards, this is the ideal length for a pedestrian shopping street. That's exactly how far people are willing to walk to go shopping. The street was straight, running west to east. That meant the south side got sun all day long, perfect for summer terraces and cafes. At the western end, the street ended at the square in front of the city hall. At the eastern end, it led down to the river. Daniel stopped by the river. It was small, about 20 meters wide. The banks were overgrown. Trash lay in the reeds, but the water was clean. He saw an opportunity that no one else had noticed. This street was the ready-made backbone of the future city. All it needed were sidewalks, trees, building facades, and people. He returned to City Hall by 9. The staff were already at their posts. Daniel called a meeting. All 12 members of the day shift showed up. They took their seats in the conference room, which was simply a large room with a long table and chairs of various colors. Daniel stood at the whiteboard. He drew a rectangle. He wrote at the top, Tewa Row, 800 meters. He announced that this was the first project, the renovation of the main street, a complete reconstruction of the sidewalks, widening them to 3.5 meters, planting trees every 15 meters, painting the building facades, at least on the first row, installing benches every 50 meters, new lighting, additional lights in addition to the existing street lights. Park raised his hand. He asked where the money would come from. Daniel replied, from the road repair budget. Park said that the road repair budget was 120 million won per year, and that was barely enough to patch potholes throughout the entire district. Daniel nodded. He said that this year, the entire road budget would go toward a single street, Tewa Row. The room buzzed. Engineer No Tae-hwan, the district's only engineer, a man in his 60s with calloused hands. He asked, "What about the other roads?" Daniel looked at him and explained, "Spreading 120 million won thinly across the entire district won't fix anything. It's like a band-aid on a broken bone. But investing 120 million won in a single street will create an effect that will pay for itself tenfold." He wrote on the board, "A high-quality pedestrian street with a sidewalk width of 3 meters increases property values on adjacent lots by 15 to 25% in the first year. It increases pedestrian traffic by 40%. It attracts small businesses. It creates what are known as third places, places where people spend time between home and work. Cafes, hair salons, bookstores. He looked at their faces. No one understood, but no one argued either, except for Park. Park said it was an irresponsible waste of money. Daniel replied that an irresponsible waste of money was 23 years of poverty distribution. Park fell silent. The number 23 hit the mark. After the meeting, Daniel stayed in his office. He needed an ally, someone who knew how to work with numbers and wasn't afraid of Park. He opened the personnel file again. He flipped through the pages, and he found her. Lee Ha-un, 27 years old, position junior auditor. The only employee under 35. Education, School of Finance, Seoul National University. Honors degree. Experience, 2 years at the Ministry of Finance. Reason for transfer, disciplinary action, refusal to sign a financial report. Daniel reread the last line. Refusal to sign a report. At the ministry. At 25 years old. He called the front desk. He asked to speak with Lee Ha-un. 10 minutes later, a young woman entered the office. A business suit, thin-framed glasses, her hair pulled back, her back straight. She bowed exactly 1 degree as protocol dictated, and not a millimeter more. Daniel invited her to sit down. She sat on the edge of the chair. He asked why she had refused to sign that report. Lee Ha-un replied briefly, because the figures in it were false. Daniel asked which ones specifically. She named them. The expense line for infrastructure grants, an overrun of 400 million won, and the diversion of funds to affiliated contractors. Daniel nodded. He asked if she could conduct a full audit of Taewagun's current budget within a week. Lee Ha-un looked at him. For the first time during their entire conversation, something other than formal politeness appeared in her eyes. She said she could do it in 5 days. Daniel smiled genuinely for the first time that day. He told her she had 3 days. She didn't smile back, but she nodded and left. 2 hours after his conversation with Lee Ha-un, an uninvited guest arrived at Daniel's office. It was County Police Chief Kim Jong-soo, a burly 52-year-old man with a square jaw and a voice accustomed to not being interrupted. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door, sat down in the chair across from Daniel, placed his hands on the table, and said he wanted to talk. His words were polite. His tone was not. He said he respected the governor's decisions, but streetlights were one thing and plans to repair the street were another. He said there was order in Taewagun. Perhaps not perfect, but understandable. People knew what to expect. And when a newcomer from Seoul arrived and started moving money around and changing priorities, it created unrest. He called Daniel a boy from Seoul. Not directly, but clearly enough. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When Kim finished, Daniel calmly asked how many theft reports had been filed last month. Kim gave a number, 14. Daniel asked how many had been solved. Kim hesitated. 2. Daniel asked how many patrol officers were on the night shift. Kim answered, 3, for the entire district. Daniel nodded. He said he understood his concerns, and that when the streetlights come on, the streets seem wider, and people start going out in the evenings. The number of thefts drops on its own, without additional patrol officers. This isn't a theory. It's statistics from 30 American cities, which Kim, of course, couldn't have known about. Kim stood up. He looked at Daniel with a long, lingering gaze. He said he'd see how things went, and he left, without saying goodbye. Daniel jotted down in his notebook, Kim Jong-soo, not an enemy, for now, but not an ally either. He's watching, waiting for a mistake. That night, Daniel climbed back up onto the roof. The streetlights were on, all 520 of them, and he began to count. Not the streetlights, the days. The Census registration system worked simply. Every registered resident contributed monthly payments to the district from the National Fund, the base rate, resource packages, tax multipliers. 31,000 residents at the current rate yielded 800 million a year. Debt, 2.3 billion. At the current outflow rate of 4% per year, in 5 years, the population would drop to 25,000 and the budget to 600 million, and the county would die. Not figuratively, literally. The system was phasing out districts with populations below 20,000, merging them with neighboring districts. Kanyun Si, Governor Sun Min Ho. He'll swallow up Taewagun and won't even bat an eye. Daniel had a window of opportunity. He ran the numbers. If the outflow could be stopped within 3 months, if the first new residents arrived by the 6th month, if the population could be brought up to 35,000 in the first year, then the budget would grow to 900 million. The debt would begin to shrink, and there would be room to maneuver. 3 months, 90 days. He opened his notebook. He wrote the title, Operation Taewa Ro. Below that, 3 points. Weeks 1 and 2, project and budget estimate. Weeks 3 and 4, start of work. Months 2 and 3, completion of the first phase. In parallel, Lee Ha-eun's audit, find the money that's leaking away. In parallel, school, clinic, 2 projects that will determine in 6 months whether Taewagong lives or dies. He closed the notebook. The wind from the sea blew in his face. Somewhere below, a door slammed. A car drove by, the only one in the last half hour. The city was asleep, but the streetlights were on. On the 3rd day, Lee Ha-eun placed a folder as thick as 2 fingers on Daniel's desk. She didn't sit down. She stood before the desk as if before a tribunal. Her back was straight. Her hands were at her sides. Her glasses glinted in the light of the single lamp. She said she had finished the audit. In 2 days, not 3. Daniel opened the folder. The first page, a summary table. He began to read, and as he read, his face grew stony. Land Department, Chief Hong Jae-min. Over the past 4 years, 23 parcels of land have been sold from municipal ownership at prices below the assessed value. The average discount was 62%. Buyers. 8 of the 23 transactions were registered to names that, upon verification, led back to the same family, the family of Hong Jae-min. Daniel turned the page. Procurement Department. Purchases of office supplies and consumables. Last year's total? 114 million won for 47 employees. That's 2.4 million per person per year. For comparison, the average for districts of a similar size is 300,000, an 8-fold difference. Lee Ha-eun marked where the rest of the money went with a dotted line. To the supply contractor, a company that turned out to be registered under Hong's cousin. Daniel closed the folder. He looked at Lee Ha-eun. He asked if there was more. She nodded. Yes, small and medium-sized ones. The transportation department is writing off fuel for 3 vehicles. Only 1 is in operation in the district. The public works department is paying for trash removal from buildings that don't exist. Park knows all about this. He doesn't steal himself. He simply turns a blind eye. Because noticing means causing conflict. And Park doesn't cause conflict. Park survives. Daniel stood up. He paced around the office. He walked over to the window. He looked out at the empty parking lot. And he made a decision. An hour later, he called Hong Jae-min. Hong walked in with a smile. That very same lazy smile of a man who'd been doing whatever he wanted for 20 years because no one had ever checked up on him. Daniel placed 3 sheets of paper from Lee Ha-eun's folder in front of him. Land deals, buyers' names, and family connections. Hong stopped smiling. He looked at the papers, then at Daniel, then back at the papers. Daniel told him he had 2 options. The first, write a letter of resignation of his own accord, right now, right here at the desk, with this pen. The second, Daniel would forward the materials to the district attorney's office, and the case would proceed as a criminal matter. Hong was silent for 20 seconds. Then He picked up the pen. He wrote the letter. He stood up. He walked to the door. At the door, he turned around. He said that Daniel didn't know what city he was in, that they had their own rules here, and that people who break those rules don't stick around for long. Daniel replied that he'd already died once, and that this wasn't the scariest threat he'd ever heard. Hong left. Daniel sat down. He fell into thought. Han's words were a threat, but behind the threat lay something else. Confidence, not in himself. Han wasn't smart enough to be confident in himself. Confidence in something behind him, or in someone. Daniel jotted it down in his notebook. Han, not a loner. Someone's backing him. Find out. Next, he fired the head of the procurement department. The man left quietly. No threats, no words. He simply packed up his things and left. Daniel temporarily appointed one of Park's assistants to replace him, a quiet woman of about 45 who, in 20 years on the job, had never received a promotion. She looked at Daniel with an expression he couldn't read, either gratitude or horror, or both. By the evening of the third day, the Taewagun administration was 2 people shorter, and 1 truth richer. Daniel summoned Pak. Pak entered slowly. He sat down heavily. He already knew. Daniel didn't fire him. Park hadn't stolen anything. Park had turned a blind eye. That was different. And right now, Daniel needed someone who knew every pipe, every wire, every meter of this district. Park knew. 23 years isn't just seniority, it's a legacy. Daniel told Pak that he was keeping him on, but on one condition. From this day forward, every invoice would undergo a double check. Pak would sign it. Lee Ha-eun would verify it. If the numbers didn't add up, Daniel would be the first to know. Pak nodded. He looked like a man who had been both sentenced and pardoned at the same time. On the 4th day, work began on Tewaro. Daniel hired 12 local workers, not through a contractor, but directly. The daily rate was 120,000 won, 20% higher than the county average. He knew what he was doing. These 12 men would tell their wives. The wives would tell their neighbors. By the end of the week, all of Taewagun would know that the new governor was hiring locals and paying them more than anyone else. It was cheaper than any advertisement. Work began at the western end of the street, starting from the square in front of the county administration building. The first thing the workers did was tear up the old asphalt on the sidewalk. Beneath it was a solid ton foundation. Daniel crouched down. He felt the concrete. It was solid. It had been laid 40 years ago when Taewagun was a mining town and built to last. That saved millions. There was no need to replace the foundation, just the top layer. On the 5th day, the first truck arrived with sidewalk pavers. Daniel chose light gray. Not white. White gets dirty. Not dark. Dark absorbs heat in the summer and creates a feeling of heaviness. Light gray. Neutral. It makes the space look bigger. He knew this because he'd spent 3 months in Oakland testing 14 shades of paving stones on a test site and gauging how passers-by reacted to each one. A small detail, but cities are built from small details. On the 6th day, something happened that Daniel hadn't planned for. An old woman came to the construction site. Small, withered, with wrinkles as deep as cracks in old asphalt. She stood there watching. The workers paid her no mind. Daniel approached her. He asked if he could help. She looked up at him. She asked if he was the new governor. He confirmed it. She said her name was Cho Mi-suk, that she owned a cafe 30 meters from there, the only cafe in Taewagun. She said she'd seen 7 governors come and go. Not a single one of them had ever come down to this street. They sat in their offices, wrote reports, and left. She asked how he was any different. Daniel looked at her. Then he looked at her cafe. A small space with a door that didn't close properly. The sign was faded but still legible. There were pots of flowers in the window, the only live flowers he'd seen on this street. He answered. He said that in 2 months there would be a 3.5-meter wide sidewalk in front of her cafe, meters wide. That he would plant a tree just so that it would provide shade for her summer tables, but wouldn't block the view of the mountains from her window. That he would put a bench across from the entrance so people could sit down and see her sign. And that when that happened, she would have 3 times as many customers. Choi Hamoni looked at him for a long time. Then she said that he was either a better liar than anyone else or actually knew something. And she left. An hour later, a worker brought Daniel a cup of coffee. He said the old lady from the cafe had sent it. Daniel took a sip. The coffee was much better than the instant kind. He smiled. On the 7th day, Daniel first encountered the name that would change his entire strategy. Lee Ha-eun brought an interim report on incoming correspondence. Among the papers was a letter from the Gangneung-si office, a neighboring district, signed personally by Governor Song Min-ho. The letter was polite and diplomatic. It stated that Gangneung City was concerned about the situation in Taewa-gun, that the neighbor was ready to help, that there was a program to resettle residents from depressed areas to well-developed ones, that families who moved to Gangneung City would receive a housing certificate worth 10 million won and a spot in a new school for their children. Daniel read the letter twice. This wasn't help. It was an invitation to surrender. Son Min-ho didn't want to help Taewa-gun. He wanted to take its last remaining residents. Every family that moved to Gangneung-si would increase its budget and decrease Taewa-gun's. 10 million won per family. For prosperous Gangneung, that was pocket change. For dying Taewa, it was a stab in the back. Daniel set the letter down on the table. He looked at Lee Ha-eun. He asked how long such letters been coming in. She replied, every quarter, for the past 3 years. 47 families have already taken advantage of the program. 47 families. That's about 150 people, 5% of the population. Stolen by a single letter. Daniel picked up a pen. He wrote one word on the letter, reply. Then he paused. He thought. He crossed it out. He wrote another one, wait. Now is not the time for answers. Now is the time for action. Sun Min-ho's best response will not be words, but a sidewalk. Not a letter, but a school. Not diplomacy, but streetlights that stay on all night. The renovation of Taewa Row was moving quickly, faster than Daniel had expected. By the end of the 2nd week, the western third of the street already looked different. Light gray pavers, a 3.5-meter wide sidewalk, the first 3 trees. Young maple trees brought from a nursery 2 hours away. Daniel had chosen the species himself. Maple trees turn red in the fall, and it's the only tree that's equally beautiful in spring and fall. In 10 years, these maples will form a tunnel of branches over the entire street. He'd seen something like that in Barcelona on La Rambla, but he didn't tell anyone about it. The workers began to treat him differently. On the first day, they looked at the young governor in his suit as if he were an alien. By the end of the first week, he knew everyone by name. An Ju-ho is a bricklayer, 58 years old, 20 years in the mines. After the mine closed, he worked as a seasonal laborer in Gangneung, a 2-hour bus ride each way. Cho Byung-hyun is the youngest, 31 years old, an electrician. He wanted to move to Busan, but his mother has bad legs and refuses to move. Yoon Sang-ho, 52 years old, a former foreman at the mine. Hands like shovels. A man of few words. Does the work of 2 men. Daniel didn't just know their names. He wrote them down. In his notebook, there was a note next to each name. An Ju-ho, an experienced bricklayer, a potential foreman for future construction projects. Cho Byung-hyun, electrician, needed for the power grid modernization. Offer a permanent position in the public utilities department. Yoon Sang-ho, a leader, respected by the workers, could be put in charge of the county's future repair crew. Every person is more than just a line in a report. Every person is a resource and an investment. Toward the end of the second week, two events occurred. The first, Lee Ha-eun walked into Daniel's office at 8 in the evening, without knocking, for the first time. She placed a sheet of paper with a single number on the desk. 342 million won. Daniel looked at the number. He asked what it was. Lee Ha-eun replied, "This is money the district can get right now. I found it. I didn't steal it. I didn't print it." She found it. 114 million. Savings from eliminating fictitious purchases that went through Han's company. 80 million. A recalculation of resource packages. The previous administration had filled out applications to the National Fund incorrectly, and for 3 years, the county received 80 million less than it was entitled to. 148 million. Refund of overpaid electricity bills. The county had been paying industrial rates for buildings that had stood empty for 10 years. Lee Ha-eun switched them to the conservation rate and filed a claim for a 3-year refund. 342 million. This didn't solve the debt problem, but it was a breath of fresh air. Space. Time. Daniel looked at Lee Ha-eun. She stood motionless, waiting for a reaction. He said it was the best financial work he'd seen in both of his lives. Then he caught himself. She didn't understand what he meant by both lives. She chalked it up to a figure of speech. He quickly added that he meant his studies and his work. She nodded. She didn't smile. But something had changed in the way she stood. A little more relaxed. A little less tense. The second incident happened that same evening. At 10 o'clock, Daniel received a call. An unfamiliar number. A man's voice. He introduced himself as an aide to Governor Song Min-ho of Gangneung City. The voice was smooth and confident. The aide relayed that Song Min-ho would like to meet with the new governor of Taewagun. Lunch. A restaurant in Gangneung City. The day after tomorrow. Daniel agreed. He hung up the phone. He sat on the edge of the bed in his small room with the scorched carpet. And he began to think. Song Min-ho wants to see him in person, to assess him, to understand how serious the threat is. Daniel knew this type. There were two like him at San Francisco City Hall. Charming, smart, absolutely ruthless toward those they consider competitors, but blind to those they consider weaker than themselves. That's their vulnerability. They don't attack until they sense danger, which means Daniel's task at this dinner is to appear safe, harmless, young, inexperienced, a soul boy who's been exiled to the middle of nowhere and is just trying not to drown. Let Son relax. Let him decide that Taewagun is still a hopeless case. Let him stop looking this way for 3 months. 3 months is all it takes. 2 days later, Daniel was sitting in a restaurant on the 23rd floor of the tallest building in Gangneung-si. Panoramic windows, the sea, the city below sparkled, new roads, glass facades, a park with a fountain. Gangneung City was everything that Taewagun was not. Rich, clean, growing. A population of 218,000 with an 8% increase over the past year. Part of that growth came from Taewagun. Son Min-ho looked exactly as Daniel had expected. 45 years old, fit, a nice suit, a smile that turned on and off like a light switch, a firm handshake, demonstratively firm. Lunch lasted an hour and a half. Son talked a lot, about himself, about Gangneung City, about expansion plans, about how difficult it is to be a successful region because everyone wants to move there and the infrastructure can't keep up. It was a show. Every word conveyed the same message. I am great. You are small. Know your place. Daniel played his part perfectly. He listened with respect. He asked naive questions. He marveled at the view from the window. Not once did he mention the streetlights. Not once did he mention Tewaro. Not once did he say anything that would reveal the scale of his plans. Son asked how things were going in Tewagun. Daniel replied that it was tough, that he was trying to figure things out, that he hoped to at least stabilize the situation. Son nodded with sympathy that was as fake as his smile. He offered to help. He mentioned the resettlement program again. He said his doors were always open to the residents of Tewagun who were looking for a better life. Daniel thanked him, sincerely, or so it seemed. On the way back in the car, Daniel took out a notepad. He wrote, Son Min Ho, underestimates the situation. Fine, the safety window is 3 to 4 months. Then he'll see the numbers and start taking action. We need to be ready. Below that, he jotted down another observation. A map of the East Coast hung on the wall in Son's office. Gangneung City was at the center, but 4 other counties were marked on the map, all small ones, all in decline. Tewagun was among them, marked in red, like targets. Son wasn't just poaching people, he was swallowing up his neighbors, systematically. Tewagun was next in line. When he returned, Daniel worked until 3 in the morning. Ihaun's 342 million had to be allocated with surgical precision. 100 million to complete Tewaro. That would cover the second and third thirds of the street. By the end of the 3rd month, the entire street would be ready. 80 million for renovating the old elementary school building. He hadn't seen the building yet, but he'd found it on the map. 600 meters from the main street. The perfect distance. A child can walk there. Parents can walk there. A school within walking distance is one of the most powerful draws. Young families don't move to where the jobs are. They move to where their child can walk to school. This was a rule he derived from 10 years of working with American cities. 60 million for the clinic. Not a new one, not yet, but to renovate the existing one. Expanding the schedule to 5 days a week instead of 3. Purchasing basic equipment. Hiring medical staff. He set aside the remaining 102 million as a reserve. Untouchable. In case of unforeseen expenses or sabotage. Because there would be sabotage. Hong was gone, but his words remained. This place had its own rules. Someone was behind Hong. Someone who stood to lose if Taewagong came back to life. Daniel didn't know who yet, but he knew he would find out. The next morning, he went out onto Taewaro. The workers were already there. Anju Ho was laying tiles with a precision that would have impressed any foreman in San Francisco. Every joint was even. Every line was straight. 20 years in the mines had taught this man to work with stone in a way that would make even an Italian master envious. Daniel stopped. He looked at the first 100 meters of the finished sidewalk. Light-colored tiles, a young maple tree, a bench, a new street light, and next to it, the old faded facade of the pharmacy. The contrast was jarring. The sidewalk spoke. It could be beautiful here, the facade replied, but not yet. Daniel realized that you can't wait for facades. You can't wait for the owners to paint them themselves. They won't paint them. They don't have the money. They don't have the motivation. They don't have hope. He went back to his office. He called Pak. He asked how much it would cost to paint a single facade on the main street. Park did the math, between 1.5 and 3 million won, depending on the size. There were 26 buildings on the entire street. That's between 40 and 80 million. Money they didn't have. Daniel sat and thought. In Detroit, he'd seen a program that solved this problem. The city didn't pay for the painting. The city bought the paint and gave it away for free. The owners painted themselves or hired neighbors. The program's cost dropped 5-fold. He asked Pak how much the paint alone would cost. Pak did the math. 7 to 8 million for all 26 buildings. Daniel nodded. From the reserve fund. The program had a simple name. Paint Your House. The county provides the paint. The owner does the painting. If the owner lacks the strength or health to do so, neighbors or workers from Tewaro do the painting in their spare time for an additional fee. Pak looked at Daniel as if he were a man from another planet. Not because the idea was complicated, but because in 23 years, not a single governor had proposed anything like it. They all thought in terms of budgets and reports. This one thought in terms of cans of paint. By the end of the first month, Tewaro was unrecognizable. 400 meters, half the street, light-colored pavers, 7 young maple trees, 10 benches, 12 new streetlights on low poles casting a warm white glow, 8 freshly painted facades. Daniel stood at the eastern end of the street and looked toward the west. The perspective worked. His gaze followed the sidewalk, past the trees, toward the square by the city hall. The street was coming to life. It wasn't beautiful yet, but it was no longer dead, and people could feel it. Chea Haramoni had told him yesterday that 4 new customers had come to her cafe over the past week. 4. In a city where not a single new customer had shown up in a year, 4 in a week was a big deal. One of them, a young man in his 30s, asked how much it cost to rent the space next door. Chea Haramoni didn't know, but she remembered his face, and she told Daniel about it. Daniel made a note of it, the first inquiry about renting. Day 31. It was early, earlier than he'd predicted. In Detroit, the first commercial interest in the renovated streets usually appeared in the 3rd or 4th month. Here, it was after just 1 month. Maybe because the town is small and rumors spread faster. Maybe because demand had been suppressed, not absent. People wanted it. They just didn't believe it was possible. In the morning, Daniel went to check out the school, the old Tewa Elementary School. The building was 600 meters from Main Street, 2 stories, brick. It had been closed for 7 years. He walked in through a door that didn't lock because the lock had broken 5 years ago and no one had fixed it. Inside, it was empty and quiet. A hallway with linoleum flooring. Classrooms with desks that no one hadn't removed. Chalk remained on the blackboard in one of the classrooms. One of the last students had written, "Goodbye, school." Daniel stood in that classroom and felt as though his 2 lives had converged once again at a single point. In San Francisco, he'd been working on a school renovation project in Bayview. He didn't finish it in time. Here, he'd have time. He took out a notebook and began making a list. Roof. Leaking in 3 places. You can tell by the streaks on the ceiling. Windows. Old wooden frames. Replace. Floor. Remove the linoleum. Lay new flooring. Plumbing. Check everything thoroughly. Heating. Boiler. Age unknown. Most likely needs to be replaced. Playground. The sports field behind the building is overgrown with grass. Clear it out. Install new equipment. He did the math. 80 million won would be enough for basic repairs. Not for a perfect school, just a functional one, so it could welcome the 1st grade class by September. That's in 5 months. Tough, but doable. As he was leaving the school, he bumped into a woman, young, about 24, overalls splattered with paint, a notepad in one hand, a pencil in the other. She was sketching the school's facade, quick, confident lines, an architectural sketch. Daniel stopped. He asked who she was. She looked up in her head. She answered in a strange mix of Korean and English. She said her name was Emma Sun, that she was from Los Angeles, that she was studying to be an architect, that she had arrived in Taewagun 2 weeks ago through a program he had launched. Daniel didn't understand right away. What program? Then he remembered. He hadn't launched any program yet. But rumors about the streetlights and the street repairs had reached Seoul via social media. and someone at the university had told her that there was a city where a young governor was rebuilding everything from scratch. She came on her own, without an invitation, without any guarantees, without any money. She stayed with an acquaintance of an acquaintance. She drew buildings because she couldn't help but draw. Daniel looked at her sketch. The school in the drawing looked just as it could have looked. Not like a ruin, but like a building, with new windows, with a painted facade, with a tree at the entrance, with children on the playground. She had drawn the children. He asked what had happened to her in Seoul. She didn't answer right away. Then she told him. Her thesis project was titled The Renovation of Dying Cities. The committee rejected it. The professor said there were no dying cities in Korea, that it was an American problem, that she should choose a practical topic. She didn't. She came here. Daniel silently took the sketchbook from her. He flipped through it. Dozens of drawings, streets, facades, squares, parks, residential neighborhoods. Each drawing was a city that didn't exist yet, but that could exist. He handed the notebook back. He told her she needed to come to his office tomorrow at 9 in the morning, that he had a project for her. She looked at him with an expression he knew well. It's the look people have when they hear yes instead of no for the first time in their lives. She nodded and left, with the sketchbook pressed to her chest as if it were a weapon. The next day, Emma arrived at 8:30. Daniel gave her an assignment, to design a renovation project for the school. Not blueprints, a sketch, a visualization of what the school would look like after the renovation, both inside and out. She asked if there were any restrictions. He replied, "The budget is 80 million. The building must not be demolished. The structure must not be altered. Everything else is up to her." She went to the school with a tape measure and a notebook. She returned 3 days later with 20 sheets of drawings. Daniel laid them out on the table. The school in the drawings was recognizable, the same brick, the same shape, but the windows were new, large ones with wide windowsills you could sit on. The facade was painted, not in one color, but two. The main color was a warm gray. The accent wall by the entrance was bright yellow. He raised an eyebrow. He asked, "Why yellow?" Emma explained, "Yellow is visible from a distance. When a child walks down the street, they should be able to see the school from 200 meters away. Yellow is a beacon. It's a signal. They're waiting for you here." Daniel looked at her. At that moment, he realized she wasn't just a talented student. She thinks like him. She thinks about the people who will use the building, about the child walking down the street, about the mother looking out the window, about the elderly man passing by. You can't teach that in college. You're born with it. He approved the project, with one amendment. He added a detail she hadn't anticipated: a small garden by the entrance, 10 square meters, where children could plant flowers. Because a child who plants a flower by the school will never leave this city. Emma jotted it down. Then she looked up and saw him in a different light. Not as the governor, as a colleague, as an architect, as a person who sees the same things she does. Work at the school began at the start of the second month, at the same time as the renovation on Taewa Road continued. Daniel divided the workers, 8 on the street, 4 at the school, plus Emma, who had become the unofficial foreman of the school project. She was on the construction site from 7 in the morning until dark, in overalls splattered with plaster, with a pencil tucked behind her ear. At first, the workers didn't take her seriously. A young woman from America? What could she possibly know about construction? Then Yoon Sang-ho, a former mining foreman, saw how she marked out the window openings with centimeter-perfect precision. He approached her and asked where she'd learned to do that. She replied that she'd learned on the job at her uncle's carpentry shop in Koreatown, Los Angeles. Yoon nodded. From then on, he addressed her formally. By the middle of the second month, Daniel received another piece of news, both good and bad at the same time. The good news, last month's census showed that the outflow had stopped. For the first time in 4 years, not a single family had moved out of Tewagun. 0. The population remained at 31,100, but the trend had been broken. The bad news came from Lee Ha-eun. She had discovered something strange in the land department's archives. Among the documents left behind after Hong's departure, she found a folder with a label that didn't fit into any standard category. Geological reports, 12 years old. The results of an expedition that surveyed abandoned mines. Lee Ha-eun wasn't a geologist. She didn't understand exactly what was written in the reports, but she realized they were classified and that they shouldn't have been in the land department head's office. She brought the folder to Daniel. He opened it, read the first page, then the second, then he closed it. He sat down and stared out the window for a long time. He wasn't a geologist, but he knew how to read reports. The document mentioned deposits beneath the closed coal mines. Not coal, something else. The terminology was technical. He didn't know all of it, but he understood the term rare earth elements. And he understood why Hong had been selling land to his family at a bargain price. And he understood why someone behind Hong's back wanted Tewagun to remain dead. A dead city means cheap land. And beneath that cheap land lies something that could be worth billions. Daniel closed the folder. He put it in his desk drawer, locked it, looked at Lee Ha-eun. He told her 2 things. First, she wasn't to tell anyone about this. No one. Not Park, not Emma, not the police, no one. Second, she was to make a copy of these documents and hide them in a place that even he didn't know about. Lee Ha-eun didn't ask why. She understood. She nodded. She took the folder. She left. Daniel was left alone. It was getting dark outside the window. The streetlights were coming on one by one. 520 lights in a city that someone very much wanted to keep in the dark. He opened his notebook. On a new page, he wrote one word, Hua Song. He didn't know that name yet, but he knew it existed. Someone had paid for the geological expedition. Someone had classified the results. Someone had been buying up land through Hong. Someone had wanted Tewagun to die quietly, and that someone now knew that a new governor had arrived, one who was turning on the streetlights and repairing the streets. Daniel closed his notebook. He had to act quickly, but carefully, because the enemy he hadn't seen yet was more dangerous than Song Min-ho. Song wanted to steal people. This unknown figure wanted to steal land. And whoever steals land won't stop at harming those who stand in his way. The next morning, Daniel went out to Tewa Row as usual. He checked on the work. He talked to the workers. He praised Anju Ho for his neat brickwork. He stopped by Grandma Che's for coffee. She said 6 people had come to see her yesterday. A new record. Daniel smiled. He finished his coffee. He stepped outside. He looked east. Beyond the river, the hills began. Behind the hills stood abandoned mines. And beneath those mines lay the future of Tewagun, or its demise, depending on who got to it first. By the 3rd month, Tewa Row was complete, all 800 meters of it. Light gray tiles from the square to the river, 21 maple trees, 32 benches, 48 streetlights. 22 of the 26 facades had been painted. 4 owners had refused. Choi Halmani was among them. Daniel stood in the square and looked down the street. Morning, 8 o'clock. And he saw something he hadn't seen once in 3 months. People. Not workers, not officials, just people. An old man with a cane was walking slowly along the sidewalk, not hugging the wall, right in the middle. Because the sidewalk was 3.5 meters wide and he didn't need to hug the edge. A woman with a stroller was coming toward him. They passed each other easily. They smiled at one another. There were two tables set up outside Choi Homini's cafe on the street. A couple in their 40s was sitting at one of them. They were drinking coffee. They were looking at the mountains at the end of the street. Daniel didn't know these people. They weren't residents of Taewagun. They had come from somewhere else to look around. He jotted it down in his notebook. Day 91. The first visitors with no particular reason. Not on business, not for work. They came just to look around. This was the beginning. Choi Homini came out to him with coffee, without being asked. She just brought it out. She said the couple was from Wonju, a 2-hour drive. They'd seen a photo of the street online. They'd come for the weekend. They asked if there was a hotel. There was no hotel in Taewagun. Daniel made a note. A hotel. He put 3 exclamation points in his head, but on paper, he just underlined it. That same day, an event occurred that shifted the balance of power within the administration. Lee Ha-eun arrived with the monthly financial report. The numbers were straightforward. The county's revenue for Daniel's third month on the job had increased by 14 million won compared to the same month last year. 14 million isn't much, but the trend mattered. For the first time in 7 years, the needle had moved upward. Park looked at the figure and remained silent. 14 million. 3 months ago, he had thought that cutting back on streetlights was a wise move. Now, the lit streetlights and the repaired street had yielded a 14 million won increase. And this was just the beginning. Daniel called a meeting. Now, Emma sat in on the meetings. No title, no salary. She just sat in the corner with a notebook and drew. No one objected. Daniel announced 3 new projects at once. First, the A Home for One Vona program. Vacant municipal buildings are transferred to interested parties free of charge. The conditions? A 5-year lease, renovations at the tenant's expense, and registration with Taewagun. Second, a 24-hour clinic. Renovate the existing building and extend its operating hours. A doctor is needed, a real doctor, not a paramedic. Third, restoring the elementary school by September, in 4 months. Park said there was no money for any of this. Daniel replied that there was money. 342 million Lee Ha-eun, plus 14 million in additional revenue, plus savings from fictitious purchases that have now become a permanent feature. Park did the math. It added up. He looked at Daniel with an expression Daniel had never seen before. Not fear, not distrust, something resembling cautious surprise. After the meeting, Daniel sat down at the computer. He needed a doctor. Not just any doctor. A doctor who would agree to come to Taewagun voluntarily. He understood that no salary would lure a good specialist from Seoul to a county with 30,000 residents and a single dilapidated clinic. He needed a different argument. He began his search, not through recruitment agencies, through the news, through medical forums, through news articles. He was looking for a doctor who had a reason to leave the big city, a personal reason. On the second day of his search, he found an article from 3 months ago. Park So-ra, 31 years old, a surgeon. She had left Seoul Central Hospital after 6 years of service. The article didn't specify the reason, but in the comments below the post, someone wrote that her mother had died in a small town while waiting for an ambulance, and that Park So-ra had subsequently declared that the healthcare system in rural areas was a crime. Daniel found her contact information through the medical license registry. He called. She picked up after the 5th ring. Her voice was sharp, wary. He introduced himself, told her who he was, told her where he was, told her he needed a doctor for a clinic that would operate around the clock. She asked about the budget. He named a figure. She was silent for a moment. Then she said it was ridiculous. He agreed. He said the budget was ridiculous, but the clinic wouldn't be ridiculous. It would be exactly as she wanted it to be. A pediatric wing, a 24-hour pharmacy, equipment according to her list, a helipad for future emergency evacuation in the future. She paused again. Longer this time. Then she asked why she should go to a place she'd never heard of. Daniel replied, "Because you've already decided that the system in the provinces is a crime, and I'm offering you the chance to build a system that won't be a crime, from scratch, on your terms." A long pause. She said she'd think about it. She hung up. Daniel put down the phone. He looked at Lee Haun, who was sitting at the next table and had heard the entire conversation. Lee Haun didn't look up from her documents, but the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. A week later, Park Sora called herself. She said she'd come to take a look. She wasn't promising anything, just to take a look. She arrived the next day, in an old sedan with Seoul license plates, wearing jeans and a white lab coat thrown over a sweater. Her hair was hastily pulled back, dark circles under her eyes. She looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in 3 months. Daniel met her in person. He took her to the clinic. The building was small, a single story with 4 rooms. The equipment was from the previous decade. There was one part-time nurse. Hannah walked through the rooms in silence. She opened the cabinets and checked the equipment. She touched the walls. 20 minutes later, she stepped out onto the porch. She sat down on the steps and said that it was worse than she'd imagined. Daniel sat down next to her. He said he knew. She looked at him. She asked what exactly he was going to do with this building. Daniel took some sketches out of the folder. Not his, Emma's. He'd asked Emma to draw the clinic the same way she'd drawn the school. Emma drew it. A 1-story building doubled in size by an addition. A separate entrance for emergencies. Wide windows. A green facade. Not a harsh green, but a soft, soothing hospital green. It's soothing. Hannah looked at the drawings. Then she looked up. She asked where the pediatric ward would be. Daniel pointed to the right wing in the drawing. She asked where the pharmacy was. He pointed to the room by the entrance. She asked where the helipad was. He spread his arms. He said there wasn't any money for that. But a helipad on the roof of the annex is included in the plans. When the money comes through, the helipad will be built. Hannah stood up. She brushed off her jeans. She said she needed to go back to Seoul to pick up her things, that she'd be back in 10 days, that she needed a list of available equipment and a budget down to the last won, and that if he ever tried to tell her how to treat people, she'd leave that very same day. Daniel nodded. She drove off. He stood on the clinic's porch and watched her sedan around the corner. Then he took out his notebook. He wrote, Hannah Park, arriving in 10 days. Clinic, budget, don't interfere. He underlined it. Don't interfere. Meanwhile, the A House for One Won program was gaining momentum. 11 applications had come in during the first 2 weeks. Daniel hadn't expected that. He'd prepared for 5. He received 11. 7 of them were from people in other cities. A young couple of ceramic artists from Daegu, an organic farmer from the suburbs of Seoul, a woodworker from Chungcheong, 2 programmers who worked remotely and were looking for a quiet place, an elderly woman from Busan who wanted to return to her hometown, and the most unexpected application? Kate Yoon, 23 years old, Seoul, heiress to the construction company Yoon Construction. Daniel read her application twice. The daughter of a construction tycoon was applying for a house priced at 1 won in a dying district. It didn't make sense. He called Seoul. He made some inquiries. Through Lee Ha-eun, who still had contacts in the ministry. The story turned out to be simple and sad. Yoon Ji-an, also known as Kate, the youngest daughter. Her father is a mid-level construction businessman. Her older brother is the heir. Kate was sent to the provinces to gain experience. Essentially, she was exiled, just like Daniel himself. She arrived 3 days later, in a white Porsche that looked like a spaceship in a potato field on the streets of Taewa-gun. She stepped out in a designer coat and high heels. She looked around, and her face said everything she thought about this place. Daniel met her on Taewa Row, on purpose, not in his office, on the street. so she could see the sidewalk, the trees, the benches, the painted facades. So her first impression wouldn't be a gray one. Kate looked at the street, then at him. She asked a question, and that was it. He said this was just the beginning. She snorted. He took her on a tour of the neighborhood. He showed her the school under renovation, the clinic, the empty buildings, a map, the plans. She listened in silence, bored. She studied her fingernails more often than the map. Then he led her to a building on the corner of Tewaru and a side street, a two-story building, a former warehouse. The walls were sturdy, the roof was intact, the windows were broken, but the frames were still in place. He said it was hers, if she wanted it, if she was ready to turn this building into the first residential building of a new type. Not just a renovation, a project. A full-fledged architectural project for a residential building that would serve as a model for the entire neighborhood. She looked at the building, then at him. She asked why she would need it. She already had an apartment in Kunam. He replied, because there are thousands of projects like that in Kunam, but here there isn't a single one. And here, everyone will see her project, not her father, not her brother. Everyone. She didn't answer. She drove off in her Porsche. Daniel wasn't sure she'd come back, but he sensed something. Something in her eyes when she looked at the building. Not interest, not boredom. Hunger. The hunger of someone who'd never been given a real job. 4 days later, Kate returned. Without the Porsche. In a taxi, with a suitcase. And in sneakers. She said one sentence to Daniel. Hannah Park arrived exactly 10 days later, just as she'd promised. She brought with her 2 suitcases of belongings and 4 boxes of medical reference books. She moved into the apartment above the clinic, the very same clinic that Daniel's workers had already begun to expand. The addition was growing quickly. The foundation was poured in a week. The walls rose half a meter a day. Kate, who officially had nothing to do with the construction, came by every morning and watched in silence. Then she would head back to her building on the corner. Hannah didn't wait for the renovations to be finished. On the second day after her arrival, she opened the old part of the clinic. She cleaned out 2 rooms herself. She mopped the floors. She set up the equipment. She hung a sign on the door. Tekwa Clinic. Open daily from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. No appointment necessary. The first patient arrived 20 minutes after opening. A 72-year-old man, knee pain. He hadn't seen a doctor in 3 years because the clinic was open only 3 days a week, and people started lining up at 5 a.m. Hannah examined him. She diagnosed advanced arthritis. She prescribed treatment. She wrote a prescription. The old man looked at her. He asked how much he owed. Hannah replied that the consultation was free under the municipal program. The old man didn't believe her. He asked again. She repeated herself. He left. An hour later, he returned with his wife. She had high blood pressure that she hadn't treated in 8 years. By the end of the first day, Hannah had seen 23 patients. By the end of the first week, 160. She worked 14-hour days, alone. No assistant, no nurse, no receptionist. Daniel saw this. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, which were getting darker. He saw her eating right in the office, a sandwich between patients. He found her a nurse, a local one, John Un-hee, 54 years old. She had worked at the old clinic as a paramedic for 20 years. Quiet, dependable. She knew every resident by name and by their medical condition. Hannah accepted her in silence, without thanks. She just nodded and went back to work. But Daniel noticed that the next day, for the first time in a week, Hannah went out for lunch. Not in her office, at Che Halmoni's cafe. So the nurse had lightened her load enough to allow her 30 minutes for lunch. That was progress. At the same time, the school was nearing completion. Emma lived at the school. Figuratively and almost literally, She arrived at 7 and left at 9 in the evening. The yellow accent wall at the entrance was painted first. It shone like a lighthouse against the backdrop of the gray houses. That was exactly what Emma had envisioned. The workers replaced the windows, new ones, large ones, with wide windowsills. Yoon Sang-ho personally installed each one, 18 windows in 3 days. In the 4th month, Daniel encountered his first serious resistance, not from Sun Min-ho, from within, the District Council of Elders. 7 people, all over 65, owners of land and former mining facilities, formally an advisory body. In reality, the people who had controlled everything that happened in Taewagun, or didn't happen. They arrived at the administration building without warning, all 7 of them. They walked into Daniel's office and sat down as if it were their office and not his. The eldest among them was Kwon Tae-sik, 78 years old, former owner of coal mine number 3. Lean, tough, eyes like coals. He spoke quietly, but in a way that made everyone fall silent. Kwon said that the council had been monitoring the new governor's actions, that they saw the street repairs, they saw the housing program, they see the school under construction, and they have questions. The first question was simple. Who gave permission to use municipal buildings for the A Home for One Won program? Daniel answered. He did, as governor, under the Municipal Property Act. Kwon nodded. Second question. Does the governor know that 4 of the 11 buildings allocated for the program stand on privately owned land? Daniel didn't know. He looked at Lee Ha-eun, who was standing by the door. She didn't know either. Kwon placed some documents on the table. 4 plots of land, privatized 8 years ago. The owners? 3 members of the Council of Elders. Daniel realized the trap. If the program operates on private land without the owner's consent, it constitutes illegal use, a scandal. An investigation from Seoul, the newspapers, the end of the program, the end of his career. Kwon wasn't threatening him. He was simply informing him, with a smile. Daniel paused. He asked them to leave the documents behind. He said he'd look into it in 3 days. The council left. Daniel closed the door. He looked at Lee Ha-eun. He asked how this was possible. She was already flipping through the land registry. An hour later, she found the answer. Hong Jae-min, the former head of the land department. Before he was fired, he'd managed to retroactively privatize 4 plots of land. The documents were dated 8 years earlier, but the signatures had been notarized 3 months ago. Hong had laid a trap before leaving. Daniel sat down. He thought. 4 buildings. 4 families who were already preparing to move. If he took the buildings away, the program would lose credibility. If he left the buildings on someone else's land, he'd be vulnerable. A day later, he found a solution. Not an elegant one, a practical one. He offered 3 council members a deal. The district would lease their land for 10 years at market rates, paid for out of the budget. The buildings would remain in the program. The owners would receive a stable income. Everyone would be happy. Kwon refused. He said he wasn't interested in a lease. He wanted to sell, at full assessed value, plus 30%, for the inconvenience. The total came to 160 million won. Daniel didn't have 160 million. He didn't even have 60 million. He was faced with a choice: back down or find money that didn't exist. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat in his office. Budget spreadsheets and a map of the district lay before him. And at 3 in the morning, he found the answer. Not in the budget, in the system. The censal registration system provided the district with allocations for each resident, a base rate plus a multiplier for infrastructure. The multiplier was calculated using a formula that took into account the number of operational public facilities, schools, clinics, road surfaces, and parks. Tekwa-gun received the minimum multiplier because previous administrations had failed to update the data. The school was listed as closed. The clinic was listed as operating 3 days a week. The road was listed as being in disrepair. If the data were updated right now, the clinic would be listed as operating daily. The school is undergoing renovation. The main street has been repaired. Then the multiplier will increase. Daniel did the math. With the new multiplier, the county will receive an additional 200 million won per year. A recalculation for the last 3 months will yield another 50 million. That will be more than enough to buy the land from the council with some to spare. And this isn't a trick. It's the law. The county simply never filed a request for a recalculation because Park didn't know it was possible. That morning, Daniel summoned Park and Lee Ha-eun. He explained the situation. Park listened with his mouth agape. In 23 years, no one had ever told him that the multiplier could be recalculated. Lee Ha-eun was already drafting the application. 10 days later, a response arrived from Seoul. Approved. A new multiplier, plus a recalculation for 3 months. 54 million won was deposited into the county's account. And starting the new month, the monthly allocations increased by 16 million. Daniel bought the land. He paid Kwon his 160 million, down to the last one. Kwon accepted the money, but his eyes said this wasn't the end, that the old man hadn't forgotten, that the young governor had turned out to be smarter than he thought, and that made him more dangerous. The A Home for 1-1 program continued. 11 families began moving in. The first were Potters from Daegu, a young couple, husband and wife. He was 28, she was 26. They were given a former store on Taewa-ro, with a large display window, perfect for a workshop. 2 weeks later, Potts appeared in the window. The first new business on the street in 12 years. By the 5th month, Daniel realized he needed a newspaper. Not a new one, an old one. The Taewa Ilbo, the only newspaper in the county. A circulation of 800 copies. Most readers are over 60. He found the newsroom in an alley off Taewa-ro, a 1-story building. The sign is crooked. The door creaks. Inside was a single room. 2 desks, 1 computer, an old printer, and a young woman sitting on the windowsill with a cigarette. Grace Chung, 26 years old, the newspaper's sole employee. Editor, reporter, layout designer, courier, all rolled into one. She looked at Daniel when he walked in. She didn't stand up. She didn't say hello. She asked what he wanted. He said he wanted to give an interview. She laughed. She said that in 3 years, not a single official had ever set foot in this room. And here was the governor himself. She asked what had happened. Someone needed publicity. Daniel sat down in the second chair. He looked around. Newspaper clippings hung on the wall. Not from the Taewa Ilbo, from major publications in Busan and Seoul. Articles with the surname John. She'd been published in major newspapers before she ended up here. He asked why she'd left Busan. She stubbed out her cigarette. Her answer was brief. She'd written an article about corruption at the port. The editor pulled the story. She made a scene. She was fired. Other publications wouldn't hire her. She had a reputation as a troublemaker. The Taewa Ilbo was the only place that didn't ask for references because no one wanted to work there. Daniel nodded. He took 3 sheets of paper out of the folder. He placed them on the table. They were figures. The county's budget before and after. Population, projects, the cost of each, results. He said he didn't want an interview. He wanted her to write a story. A real one, not PR material. A story about how a dying county is trying to survive. With numbers, with names, with problems, with failures, if there were any. She looked at the sheets, then at him. She asked why he wanted this. He replied, because in 3 months, Taewagun will be the most interesting story on the East Coast. And he needs a journalist who will tell it right. Not a state news agency that writes in bureaucratic, but a person who knows how to write in a way that people will actually read. Grace was silent. Then she put on her vintage glasses, which were lying on the table. She looked at the numbers more closely. She looked up. She said she'd take the job, but on her own terms. She writes what she sees, not what he wants her to write. If she finds problems, she'll write about the problems. If she finds mistakes, she'll write about the mistakes. No prior approval, no censorship. Daniel agreed, without hesitation. She narrowed her eyes. She couldn't believe it. Daniel said that if his reforms couldn't withstand honest journalism, then they were worthless. And he left. A week later, the first article in the series appeared in the Tewa Ilbo. It was titled "The City That Turned on Its Streetlights." 12 pages, with photographs, with figures, with quotes from workers and residents. Grace wrote about the streetlights, about Tewaro, about how 74-year-old Grandma Yu went out for an evening walk for the first time in 10 years, about the potters from Daegu who put their first pot in a store window, about Hannah who sees 20 patients a day. 800 subscribers to the Tewa Ilbo read the article. Then someone posted it online. Within 3 days, 50,000 people had read it. It was the first time the name Tewagun had appeared in the news without being associated with the words decline and outflow. Instead, it was linked to the words lanterns, school, and clinic. Sun Min Ho read this article in his office on the 23rd floor in Gangnam-si. His assistant later told someone that the governor had reread the paragraph about the 14 million increase twice and muttered something quietly to himself. 2 days after the publication in the Tewagun, a film crew from a Seoul TV station arrived. A short segment for the morning show. 3 minutes on the air. Daniel didn't give the interview himself. Instead, he put Che Halmoni in front of the camera. The grandmother talked about how she'd been running the cafe for 30 years, how the city had become deserted, how she'd open the door every morning not knowing if even a single customer would show up, and how 3 months ago, the streetlights came on, and how people are coming to see her now, 6 people a day, a new record. She didn't cry, she smiled. And that smile in the 3-minute report did more than any statistic ever could. The following week, the city administration received 23 requests for information about the A Home for One program. 23 in a week, compared to 11 over the previous 2 months. Daniel looked at the numbers and did the math. Even if just a third of those requests turned into actual moves, that's 7 or 8 families, 20 to 25 people. The population would surpass 32,000, and the numbers would keep rising. During that same period, an event took place that Daniel would remember for a long time. The opening of the school. The 6th month. Taewa Elementary School. The yellow wall glowed in the sun. The new windows sparkled. The small garden by the entrance was planted with marigolds. Emma stood at the door in a clean jumpsuit. It was the only time Daniel had ever seen her without paint splatters. The ceremony was simple. No fanfare, no speeches. Daniel declined to speak. He stood off to the side, by the tree across the street. He watched. The children were standing on the school porch, 13 of them. The first class. 13 children who, for the first time in their lives, were attending school in their home district. Before that, they had traveled 30 kilometers by bus to Kaninshi, an hour there and an hour back, every day. Now they were standing on the school porch, just 500 meters from home. Among the parents were those who had left and returned. A young mother in her 30s. She had left for Seoul 5 years ago. She worked as a courier. She returned a month ago through the A Home for One program. Her daughter stood on the porch with a backpack bigger than she was. The elderly were crying, quietly, silently. They just stood there and cried. They remembered this school when it was full. 300 children. The noise during recess. The bell you could hear from the other end of the street. Then, silence. 7 years of silence. And now, once again, 13 voices. Not many, but alive. Trehamoni approached Daniel. He didn't see her coming. She was just suddenly there, silently, without a word. She took his hand. She placed a rice cake in it, a small one, warm, wrapped in a leaf. Her signature rice cake, which she hadn't given to anyone in 10 years, ever since her son left. Daniel looked at the rice cake, then at the grandmother. She was already walking away, small, frail, with her back straight. He stood under the tree with the cake in his hand, and for the first time in 2 years in both of their lives, his eyes welled up. He didn't cry. Urban planners don't cry. But his eyes welled up. It was the 6th month. The population of Tewagun, 32,800 people, an increase of 1,700 in 3 months. The trend was upward. That evening, Daniel returned to his office. On the desk lay a note from Yi Ha-un. 4 words. Hwasong Group. She'd found a connection. He sat down. He read the document attached to the note. Yi Ha-un had traced the chain of connections. A geological report on rare earth elements from 12 years ago had been commissioned by a company called Tewa Mineral Research. The founder of that company was another company based in Seoul. The founder of that company was a holding company. The founder of the holding company was Hwasong Group, a conglomerate, one of the 20 largest in Korea. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Hwasong Group. This isn't a local businessman. This isn't a government official. This is a corporation with a turnover of trillions of won. A corporation that waited patiently for 12 years for Taewagun to die so it could buy up the land for a song, and which is now watching as the young governor revitalizes the city, raising land values, attracting people, doing everything that's derailing their plan. He took out his notebook. He opened to a page where a single word was written, Hwasong. Now he knew the name, and he understood the scale of it. This isn't Kwon with his 4 plots. This isn't Sung Min Ho with his resettlement program. This was an opponent he could not defeat alone. He closed the notebook. He looked out the window. The streetlights were on. The school stood with its yellow wall. The clinic was open. People were arriving. The city was growing. But somewhere in a Seoul office on the top floor of a glass tower, someone was looking at those same numbers and thinking about how to stop it. In the 7th month, Song Min-ho went on the offensive. The first strike was subtle, not crude. That's exactly how dangerous people operate, not with a fist, with a piece of paper. The Taewagun administration received an official notice from the Audit and Inspection Bureau of the Ministry of the Interior, an unscheduled audit of the district's financial operations of the district. The audit was to last 3 weeks. The basis? A complaint from an unnamed complainant. Daniel read the notice and smiled, not out of joy, but out of recognition. In San Francisco, this was called regulatory capture. When a competitor can't beat you in the market, they set the regulator on you. Inspections, audits, requests for documents. Every hour spent on the inspectors is an hour not spent on construction. He called Yi Ha-un. He showed her the notice. She read it. Her expression didn't change. She said 2 words. We're ready. Daniel knew she was right. The double-checking of every transaction he'd entered 3 months ago was now his shield. Every transaction was documented. Every purchase was justified. Every contract with workers was drawn up in accordance with the law. Lee Ha-un didn't just keep the books. She kept them as if she knew an audit was coming. Because she did know. She had worked at the Ministry of Finance. She knew how audits worked, and she had been preparing the documents specifically for this scenario from day one. The auditors arrived a week later, two of them, a man and a woman from Seoul, stern, polite, professional. Lee Ha-eun set aside a room for them. She provided all the documents. Every request was fulfilled within an hour. The auditors worked for 10 days. They reviewed 312 documents. They interviewed 14 employees. They checked every expense item. The result? 0 violations. 0. On the 11th day, the lead inspector came to Daniel with an interim report. He sat down across from him, took off his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. And he said something Daniel hadn't expected to hear. He said that in 15 years of audits, this was the first district with a population under 50,000 whose documentation was in perfect order. He asked who handled the financial records. Daniel pointed to Lee Ha-eun. The auditor looked at her, then back at Daniel. He nodded. He said the audit was complete. No violations were found. The report would be sent to the ministry. Daniel thanked him. He walked the auditors to their car. He returned to his office. Lee Ha-eun was standing by the window, her back to him. Her shoulders were slightly slumped. For the first time in all these months, she looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. She had been carrying this burden in silence. The dual control system, the documentation, the reports, the recalculations, everything on her own shoulders. And no one had ever once thanked her. Daniel walked over to his desk. He opened a drawer. He took out the cup of coffee he'd bought that morning at Che Hamani's cafe. It had already gone cold. He set it on the edge of her desk. There was a note on the cup. For the auditor who runs the entire district. Lee Ha-eun turned around. She saw the cup. She read the note. Her expression didn't change, but she picked up the cup with both hands and stood there like that for a few seconds, just holding the cup. Then she sat down at her desk and continued working. But something had changed. In the air, in the space between their desks, in the way she raised her head when he walked in the next morning. Barely noticeable, but it had changed. Sun Min-ho's second blow was harsher. 2 weeks after she failed the audit, an article appeared in a Seoul-based online publication. The young governor of Taewa-gun is spending the budget on cosmetics instead of infrastructure. The author of the article? Unknown. Source? Anonymous. Content. Daniel Ha spent the entire road budget on painting building facades and paving stones instead of repairing roads in remote areas of the district. Residents of villages on the outskirts are forced to drive on broken roads. The new governor cares only about the main street and ignores the rest of the county. The article was partially false. Daniel did indeed redirect the entire road budget to Taewa-ro. That's true. But the conclusions were twisted. The strategy of concentrating resources in one place isn't a whim. It's the only way to make an impact on a minimal budget. But explaining that in the media was impossible. People don't read explanations. People read headlines. Daniel called Grace. She had already seen the article. She said she knew the author, or rather, she knew the publication. It belongs to a media conglomerate that regularly receives advertising contracts from the Gangneung City Administration. The connection is direct. Sun Min-ho paid for the article. Daniel asked Grace what to do. She replied, "Nothing. Don't respond. Don't make excuses. Give her 3 days." 3 days later, Grace published the second article in the series in the Taehwa Ilbo. It was titled The 800 Meters That Changed the City. It included figures, the cost of renovating Taehwa-ro, the rise in real estate values in the surrounding areas, 18% in 3 months, the number of new rental inquiries, 14, the number of new businesses, 3, the increase in monthly tax revenue, the increase in pedestrian traffic, data from Hannah's clinic, data from the school, 13 children who no longer have to commute 30 kilometers. And the key figure, the population, 32,800 plus 1,700 in half a year. In a dying county. Grace didn't mention her competitor's article. She didn't make excuses for Daniel. She didn't argue against the accusations. She simply laid the figures on the table. Let the reader decide for themselves. The article went viral again. This time, it was read not by 50,000, but by 120,000 people. 3 Seoul-based publications asked Grace for permission to reprint it. Grace granted it. The monthly circulation of the Hwa Il-bo grew from 800 to 2,300. Grace hired an assistant for the first time, a student from Gangnam who came in twice a week. She didn't thank Daniel. She didn't tell him that he'd been right about the story. But when he walked into the newsroom a week later, a new clipping was hanging on the wall next to the old ones from Busan newspapers. It was her own article from the Hwa Il-bo. He noticed it. She noticed that he had noticed it. Neither of them said a word. Meanwhile, Kate Yoon had finished her project. The building on the corner of Taewaro, a former warehouse, 2 stories. She had been working on it for 3 months, all by herself, with 2 hired workers. The result impressed even Daniel. The first floor, an open space with high ceilings. The brick walls were left as is, cleaned but unpainted. An industrial style that would cost hundreds of millions to rent in Seoul. Large windows, wooden floors. It could have been a studio, a gallery, a store, anything. Second floor, 2 apartments, small, functional, with balconies on both sides. From one window, the mountains. From the other, Taewaro. Kate stood in the middle of the first floor in work boots, her hands covered in cement dust. Her hair was tucked under a scarf. She was unrecognizable. 3 months ago, a girl in a designer coat had stood in this very spot, asking questions, and that was all. Now standing here was a person who had built something with their own hands, for the first time in their life. Daniel surveyed the building, every corner, every detail. Then he looked at Kate. He said it was the best residential renovation project he'd seen in Taewagun. The only one, but the best. She didn't laugh. She looked at him seriously and asked if there were any other buildings. He replied that there were 47 vacant buildings in the district. She nodded. She said she needed a crew, a real one, not just 2 people, 10. She'd pay for it herself out of her father's company's fund, not as charity, as an investment, because every renovated building in a growing county is an asset. Daniel looked at her for a long time. This girl thought like a developer, not like a spoiled heiress, like a developer. He nodded. He said she'd get her crew. 8th month, population 35,200. First milestone had been met. Daniel stood in front of the county map in his office, looking at the figures that Lee Ha-eun updated every week. 35,200. 4,000 people in 8 months, in a dead county, without major investments, without federal programs, on streetlights and sidewalk tiles, on paint and maple trees, with a school that had 13 students and a clinic with a single doctor. He knew this was only the beginning, that real growth would begin once the city crossed a critical threshold, the tipping point, the point of self-sustainability, when every new resident would attract the next, not because the governor was trying, but because the city itself had become attractive. In urban planning, this is called the urban tipping point. For a city the size of Taewagun, that point is roughly 45 to 50,000. They were still a long way from it, but they were heading in the right direction. A surprise awaited him that morning. Lee Ha-eun walked in and placed an envelope from the Ministry of the Interior on the table. An official one, with the coat of arms. Daniel opened it. The ministry was inviting Taewagun County to apply for the National Regional Revitalization Program, a grant of up to 5 billion won over 3 years for counties demonstrating sustained population growth. 5 billion. Daniel reread the figure. 5 billion won. That's 6 times the county's annual budget. With that money, they could build an industrial park, a residential neighborhood, a tram line, a college. He called the ministry. He clarified the terms. The application must include a 3-year development plan, demographic projections, a financial model, and architectural designs for key facilities. The deadline for submission is 6 weeks. Daniel hung up the phone. 6 weeks. In San Francisco, a full-scale application of this level took a team of 12 people 3 months to complete. He had 4. Just him, Lee Ha-yoon, Emma, and Park. Park, who had spent 23 years filling out forms and, for the first time in his life, had to fill out a form for the sake of the future rather than for reporting purposes. He gathered them in his office. He explained, 5 billion, 6 weeks. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Lee Ha-yoon would take charge of the financial model. Emma would handle the architectural renderings. Park would handle the infrastructure and land resources data. Daniel would write the strategic section, the development plan, demographic projections, and the city concept. Work began that very day. For the first week, they worked until midnight, every day. Daniel drafted a plan that brought together everything he knew from his 2 lives. The theory of magnetic attraction, mixed-use zoning, high-density, human-scale development, green neighborhoods, pedestrian-friendly streets, third places, a new type of industrial park, not heavy industry, but light manufacturing, crafts, design, IT outsourcing, workshops. He called it Tekva Green. Emma drew, day and night. Her sketchbook turned into a portfolio that could win an architectural competition. Residential neighborhoods, 4-story buildings, no taller, because 4 stories is the limit at which a person can still see the face of a passerby from the top balcony. Above 4 stories, the street ceases to be alive. Daniel knew this from Jan Gehl's research, which he had read during his master's program. Emma knew this intuitively. When he explained the 4-story rule to her, she looked at him with that very expression, as if he were a colleague, as if he were an architect. Lee Ha-yoon was building a financial model that was a work of art. Every line was broken down by year: revenue from population growth, tax revenues, multipliers, economies of scale, return on investment in 5, 7, or 10 years. She laid out 3 scenarios: optimistic, base case, and pessimistic. Even in the pessimistic scenario, the district would still turn a profit in 4 years. Park worked quietly, without complaint. He dug up archives that hadn't been opened in decades. He found data on water supply and power grids. He drew diagrams by hand because electronic versions didn't exist. 23 years of knowledge about every pipe and every wire finally came in handy. In the 3rd week of work, an incident occurred. Late in the evening, Daniel stepped out of his office for a cup of coffee. He returned. He saw Lee Ha-yoon. She was asleep at her desk, her head resting on her hands. On the computer screen was a spreadsheet with 2,000 rows. She had been working for 18 hours straight. Daniel paused in the doorway. He took off his jacket. He approached quietly. He draped it over her shoulders. He set a cup of coffee on the desk. He wrote a note on a piece of paper and placed it next to her. Especially for the auditor who oversees the entire district. He left. He closed the door. That morning, Lee Ha-yoon came to the meeting wearing his jacket, not because she didn't have her own clothes, because she'd forgotten to take it off. Or maybe she hadn't forgotten. Daniel didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. Emma looked at both of them and smiled very quietly and looked down at her notebook. In the 4th week, Daniel received a call that changed his understanding of the entire situation. It was an unknown number, a man's voice. He introduced himself as Yoon Jae-gon, Kate's father, the head of Yoon Construction. His voice was deep, authoritative. He said he knew about his daughter's activities in Tewagun, that he had seen photos of the buildings she had renovated, and that he had a business proposal. Yoon Construction was ready to serve as the contractor for the construction of a residential complex in Tewagun at a preferential rate on a joint venture basis. It was an opportunity. A construction company with experience and resources, a preferential rate, a joint venture? For a grant application, this was a trump card. A real contractor with a real commitment. But Daniel sensed something was off. Not in the words, in the tone, in the way Mr. Yoon spoke about his daughter. Not with pride, with surprise, as if she were a child who had unexpectedly learned to walk. Daniel accepted the offer, cautiously, with no strings attached. He said he would include Yoon Construction in the application as a potential partner. They would discuss the details later. Yoon Sr. agreed. He hung up the phone. Daniel jotted down a note in his notebook. Mr. Yoon, not interested in Taewa, but in his daughter. Watching, assessing, from a distance for now. By the 5th week, the proposal was almost ready. 120 pages. Daniel was rereading the final draft at 3 in the morning, and he paused at one paragraph. The concept, he wrote, Taewagun doesn't aim to be a copy of Seoul. Taewagun aims to be an alternative to Seoul. A city where a child can walk to school in 7 minutes, where a doctor can reach a patient in 8 minutes, where an elderly person can have coffee with a friend without having to ride the subway for 20 stops, where every building is no taller than 4 stories because people should be able to see the sky, where every street leads to a park, where every park leads to people. He reread it. He thought. In San Francisco, such words would have drawn a smirk. Too idealistic, too naive. But he wasn't sitting in San Francisco. He was sitting in Taewagun, where 13 children walk to school, where Grandma Che serves coffee to 6 customers a day, where Hannah Park sees 20 patients, where Emma draws a city that doesn't exist yet, where Lee Ha-eun counts every one, where Kate builds houses from ruins, where Grace writes for a newspaper that people actually read now. He left the paragraph as is. In the 6th week, they sent the proposal, by courier, to Seoul, 120 pages, plus 40 pages of Emma's visualizations, plus Lee Ha-eun's 60-page financial model, plus Park's infrastructure plan on 30 pages, 250 pages, compiled by 4 people in 6 weeks, in an office with only one working printer. They promised a response in 2 months. Daniel didn't wait. Waiting meant wasting time. The next day, he announced the start of work on what he called the Green Quarter, Taewagun's first pedestrian-only district. 4 streets surrounding Taewa-ro. No car traffic. Artisans' workshops on the ground floors. Residences on the upper floors. Trees, benches, small plazas. He started with what was already there, with the 11 families from the A Home for 1-1 program, with Kate and her team, with Emma and her notebook, without a grant, on the current budget. Because a city doesn't wait for permission to grow. A city grows when it's allowed to. The 10th month. Population 38,400. The Green Quarter was growing, slowly, but it was growing. Kate brought in a crew of 10 people, not from Seoul, locals. She hired the same workers who had renovated Taewa-ro. An Ju-ho became the foreman. Yoon Sung-ho was his deputy. Cho Byung-hyun was in charge of the electrical work. The people who had spent 3 months laying sidewalk tiles were now erecting the walls of residential buildings. They knew every brick in this city, and the city knew them. The first 4 buildings in the Green Quarter were ready by the end of the 10th month. A former warehouse, a former workshop, 2 former residential buildings. Kate used the same principle as in her first project. Don't tear them down. Preserve the walls, clean the brick, replace the windows, add balconies. Ground floors for workshops, upper floors for living quarters, 4 stories maximum. Daniel's rule. Emma drew up a plan for the quarter as a single entity, not separate buildings, but the space between them. 6-meter-wide streets, wide enough for pedestrians and cyclists, not wide enough for cars. Small squares at intersections, 3 by 3 meters, space for a bench and a tree. She called them pocket squares. Daniel recognized the concept, pocket parks, coined in New York in the 1960s. He didn't tell her that. She had come to the same conclusion on her own, from another country, from another generation. That meant the idea was sound. In the 11th month, a reply arrived from Seoul. The grant was approved. Not 5 billion, 3.2 billion won, 64% of the amount requested. The ministry had cut the budget for the tram line and the college. It had spared the industrial park and the housing fund. Daniel read the letter. 3 billion and 2/10, 4 times the annual budget. His hands didn't tremble, but he set his coffee cup down on the table a little louder than usual. Lee Ha-eun looked up. He showed her the figure. She looked at it. Then she looked at him, and for the first time in all these months, she smiled. Not broadly, just the corners of her lips, but it was a smile. Daniel announced it at the meeting. Park dropped his pen. Emma jumped up and hugged Kate, who was standing next to her. Kate froze. Then she awkwardly hugged her back. She wasn't used to hugs. Grace heard the news an hour later. She came to the administration office. She asked one question. How much? Daniel gave her the figure. She wrote it down. She left. The next day, an article appeared in the Daewha Ilbo. 3 billion won. The city that had lit its streetlights was given a chance to become a real city. The issue's circulation was 3,400, a new record. A week after the grant was announced, Sun Min-ho called Daniel, personally, not through an assistant. His voice sounded different, not smooth, not patronizing, harsh. He said he wanted to meet. Daniel suggested Daewha-gong. Sun hesitated. Then he agreed. He arrived 2 days later, in a black Genesis with tinted windows. He got out at the plaza in front of the city administration building. He looked at Daewha Row, at the trees, at the sidewalk, at the painted facades, at the sign for the ceramics workshop, at the tables outside Che Halmoni's cafe, where people were sitting. His face was calm, but Daniel could see him taking stock. How his eyes moved from building to building, how he was assessing the scale of the changes, and couldn't believe it. They sat down in Daniel's office. Sun didn't waste time on pleasantries. He got straight to the point. The resettlement program is being shut down. Ganyan City will no longer offer housing certificates to residents of Daewha-gun. Daniel expected a catch. Son continued. Instead, he was proposing a joint project, a transportation corridor between Ganyan City and Daewha-gun, an expressway. 30 minutes instead of an hour and a half. Split financing. This was unexpected. Daniel had thought Son had come with a threat, but he had come with a proposal. Yet Daniel knew people like that. The proposal was simply another form of control. An expressway between the two cities would turn Little Daewha into a suburb of Greater Ganyun. People would live in Daewha but work in Ganyun City. Money flows in one direction, taxes in the other. Daewha is becoming a bedroom community. It's losing its independence. That was exactly what Daniel didn't want. He said he'd think about it. Son nodded. He stood up, shook his hand, smiled. The same smile. On, off. He drove away. Daniel sat down and wrote in his notebook. Son is changing his strategy. He can't absorb it. He's trying to tie it down. The answer? No. Daewha-gun will be an independent city, not a suburb. But a road is needed, on our terms, not on his. Alongside politics and grants, life in Daewha-gun was changing every day. in small details that Daniel recorded in his notebook with the obsession of a scientist. A second coffee shop opened on Tewa Row. A young barista from Seoul, 24 years old. He came through the A House for One program. He rented the space of a former barber shop, a blue facade. He brewed coffee using a professional machine he'd brought with him from the capital. Che Harmony visited him on the first day. She tried the coffee, then she left. The next day, she added lattes to her menu. Competition, healthy, lively. A bakery opened on a side street. A woodworker from Chuncheon put his first pieces of furniture up for sale. Programmers from the House for One program set up a co-working space on the second floor of a former warehouse. They set up a router and a table. That's all they needed. 3 more people started joining them. Daniel didn't know where they came from. They just showed up, like seeds after the rain. Hannah expanded the clinic. The addition was ready. 4 offices instead of 2. A pediatric wing. Small, just 1 room, but with bright walls that Emma had painted. Giraffes and trees. Hannah hired a second doctor, a young general practitioner from Chuncheon, 28 years old. He came because he'd read Grace's article, and because Hannah had personally called him and told him she needed someone who wasn't afraid to work. He wasn't afraid. The school admitted its second class, 21 students, plus the original 13. 34 children. Emma walked past the school every morning. She heard the noise during recess, and every time she paused for a second. She listened. Then she kept walking. Daniel noticed this. He didn't say anything, but he understood. To her, that sound meant that her thesis project hadn't been a mistake, that there were dying cities in Korea, and that they could be brought back to life. By the end of the 11th month, the population of Taewagun stood at 41,500 people, 10,000 in 11 months. For the first time in history, the county's budget was in the black. The debt had been reduced to 1 billion won. Lee Ha-eun drew up a repayment schedule. At the current rate of growth, the debt would be paid off in 18 months. Daniel stood on the roof of the administrative building. He looked at the lights. There were more of them. Not just streetlights, windows, lively windows, lights in houses that had been dark a year ago. He opened his notebook. Item 1, streetlights, done. Item 2, sidewalks, done. Item 3, building facades, done. Item 4, find money that doesn't exist, done. He wrote a new list. Item 1, Taekwa Green Industrial Park. Item 2, a residential neighborhood with 500 apartments. Item 3, deal with Hwasong Group. He underlined the last item twice. 1 year and 2 months. Construction of the Taekwa Green Industrial Park began on the eastern outskirts of the city, the site of a former miners' depot, 6 hectares. Daniel chose this location for 3 reasons: its proximity to the river, flat terrain, and symbolism. Where coal was once mined, the future will now be created. The park's concept was unusual for Korea. No plants, no factories, workshops, ceramics, woodworking, textile design, graphic design studios, small IT companies. Everything light. Everything clean. Everything that could fit into a building the size of a 2-story house. Daniel designed the park like a village, not like an industrial zone. The buildings stood around a central square. Between them were paths and trees. A cafeteria in the center. Parking was moved to the perimeter. Only pedestrians were allowed inside. He knew that industrial parks fail when they become gray concrete boxes behind a fence. People don't want to spend 10 hours in a concrete box. People want windows and trees and a place where they can have a cup of coffee and chat with their workshop neighbor. Emma drew up the master plan. 24 buildings, modular. Each can be divided into 2 or 4 sections depending on the tenant. Facades made of local stone. Green roofs, literally, with vegetation. for insulation, and for beauty. Kate took charge of the construction. Young Construction sent in the equipment: 2 excavators, a crane, a concrete mixer. Kate stood on the construction site wearing a hard hat and giving orders. Anju Ho worked nearby. He was still laying stone with the precision of an Italian master. Only now he knew why. In the second week of construction, Daniel was summoned by Kim Jong-soo, the police chief, the very same man who, during the first week, had shown up unannounced and called him a kid from Seoul. Over the past year, Kim had neither interfered nor helped. He had been watching. Now he had come with information. Kim sat down. He placed his hands on the table, heavy hands. He said that some people had come to see him, not locals, from Seoul. They introduced themselves as employees of a security agency. They asked about plots of land on the eastern outskirts, specifically about the former mine sites. They asked who owned them, who leased them, what the administration's plans were. Kim gave them formal answers. He didn't hide anything. He didn't give anything away. But then he looked up their license plate number. The car was registered to Hwasong Security, a subsidiary of Hwasong Group. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When Kim finished, Daniel asked why he decided to tell him. Kim paused. Then he answered. He said he'd lived in Taewagun for 30 years, that he'd watched the city die, that he'd gotten used to it, that he'd thought it would stay that way until the end. And then a boy from Seoul came and lit the streetlights. And Kim decided that the boy might just be a boy. But the streetlights are on, and the school is open, and in the last 3 months, not a single theft report has been filed in his precinct. 0. For the first time in 20 years. He said he didn't know who Hwasong Group was or what they wanted. But he knew that when people from Seoul came asking about land, it never ended well for those who lived on that land. Daniel thanked him. Kim stood up. He shook his hand, firmly, really firmly, and left. Daniel jotted it down in his notebook. Kim, an ally, now officially. That evening, he gathered a small group: Lee Ha-eun, Grace, no one else. He closed the door. He placed a 12-year-old geological report on the table. He told them everything. Rare earth elements beneath the mines, Hwasong Group, land acquisitions through ON, people from the security agency. Grace listened. Her eyes sparkled. Not from fear, from the thrill of the hunt. She was a journalist. This was the kind of story journalists live for. She asked what she should do. Daniel replied, dig. Quietly. No publications for now. Find the connection between the Hwasong Group and the former governor. Find documents regarding the classification of the geological report. Find the names of the people who made the decisions. Document everything. Copy everything. Hide everything. When the time came, he would give her the signal. Grace nodded. Lee Ha-eun sat in silence. Then she spoke a single sentence. She said that copies of the geological report were stored in 3 places: at her home, in a safe deposit box in Gangneung, and with her former research advisor in Seoul. If anything happens to the original, the information won't be lost. Daniel looked at her. She had prepared. Months ago. In silence, without being told, simply because she understood that it was necessary. He nodded. He couldn't find the words. He nodded. The 13th and 14th months passed in 2 distinct modes. On the surface, the city was growing. The industrial park was taking shape. The first 8 buildings out of 24 were ready by the end of the 14th month. Tenants were lining up. Ceramic Studio Number 2. A carpentry workshop, a web design studio, a small company producing organic cosmetics, a textile workshop that sewed with recycled materials, a three-person IT startup developing an app for farmers. Every tenant means jobs. Every job means a family. Every family means children in school, patients at the clinic, and customers at Choi Hamoni's cafe. The population stood at 58,000. The city had crossed the urban tipping point. Daniel could see this from the data collected by Lee Ha-un. The growth rate was accelerating, not linearly, exponentially. Every new resident attracted another, not because Daniel was trying, because the city had become attractive in its own right. Beneath the surface, other work was underway. Grace was digging, quietly, methodically. She had traveled to Seoul 3 times. She met with former colleagues from the Busan newspapers, with retired officials, with a former aide to the ex-governor of Taewagun, who now worked as a security guard at a shopping mall and was eager to tell someone what he had seen. The picture was coming together. 12 years ago, Hwasong Group commissioned a geological expedition. Deposits of rare earth elements were discovered: neodymium, cerium, and lanthanum, valued at between 8 and 12 trillion won at current prices, a figure that took Grace's breath away. Hwasong struck a deal with the governor at the time. The results were classified. The governor received an apartment in Seoul and a seat on the board of directors of a Hwasong subsidiary. The land above the mines was gradually bought up through frontmen. Hong Jae-min was one of them. The plan was simple: wait until the district died out, buy up the land for a song, and start mining. 12 years of patience. And then Daniel showed up. He turned on the lights. He drove up the value of the land. He attracted people. And he ruined the whole plan. Grace compiled a 140-page dossier. Documents, testimonies, chains of title, bank transfers, names, dates, amounts. She brought it to Daniel at the end of the 14th month, set it on the table. A thick folder, heavy. Not because of its weight, but because of its contents. Daniel flipped through it, read it. Every page was a nail in the coffin of a 12-year conspiracy. He looked at Grace. She was standing by the door. Her arms were crossed over her chest. Her glasses were perched on her forehead. A cigarette was tucked behind her ear. He said it was the best investigative report he'd ever seen. She replied that it was the only investigative report she'd ever seen through to the end, and that if he gave her the go-ahead, she'd publish it tomorrow. Daniel shook his head. Not tomorrow. Soon, but not tomorrow. First, they had to protect the city from what would happen after the story was published. Because the Hwasong Group wouldn't stand idly by. They would strike. And they had to be ready. In the 15th month, Hwasong Group struck first. That morning, Daniel arrived at the Taewa Green construction site and saw that work had come to a halt. The cranes stood idle. The excavators were turned off. The workers were sitting off to the side, smoking. Kate was standing in the middle of the site with her phone in her hand. She looked pale. She walked over to Daniel. She said her father had called. Yoon Construction was pulling out its equipment. Today. All contracts with Taewagun were being terminated. No explanation, no warning. She'd called her father 4 times. He hadn't answered. On the 5th try, his assistant said the decision was final and that Kate had better return to Seoul. Daniel looked at Kate, at her hands covered in cement dust, at the hard hat she was clutching so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, at her eyes, which held not despair, but rage. He asked if she knew why. She replied that she didn't, but she had a hunch. Yoon Construction receives 80% of its orders from 3 major clients. One of them? Hwasong Group. Daniel nodded. The picture came together. Hwasong put pressure on Mr. Yoon. Get rid of your daughter. Get rid of the equipment. Leave this city, or you'll lose your contracts. And Mr. Yoon chose the contracts. That same day, the second blow came. Hana Bank, the only bank handling Taewa Gun's accounts, it sent a notice, a revision of the credit line terms. The interest rate was raised by 4 points. The repayment term was shortened. Collateral requirements were increased. This was no coincidence. Hana Bank was part of a financial ecosystem that intersected with the Hwasong Group through common shareholders. One phone call to the right floor, and the terms change. The third blow came through the media. 3 Seoul publications simultaneously ran articles about the misuse of a grant in Taewa-gun, with identical wording, with identical quotes from anonymous sources. A coordinated attack. Daniel sat in his office. 3 documents lay before him: the equipment recall notice, the bank notice, printouts of the articles. Lee Ha-eun stood by the window, silently. He looked at her, said it was time. She nodded. He called Grace. He said 2 words: publish today. Grace didn't ask for clarification. She hung up. By evening that day, the Taehwa Ilbo had published a special edition, 24 pages, the whole story. Geological report, rare earth elements worth 8 to 12 trillion won. Hwason Group, shell companies, land buyouts. A former governor with an apartment in Seoul. Hong Jae-min, classified findings. 12 years of conspiracy. Names, dates, documents. 5,000 copies of the issue were printed. Grace sent the digital version to every major publication in the country, to every news agency, to every TV channel, to the prosecutor's office, to the ministry. Within 6 hours, 400,000 people had read the article. Within 12 hours, it was the top news story in Korea. Hwasong Group issued a press release. It called the publication defamatory. It threatened legal action. It demanded a retraction. Grace responded in the next issue. She published 30 more documents, including a copy of a bank transfer to the former governor, including the minutes of the Hwasong Mineral Research Board of Directors meeting at which the strategy to devalue Taewa-gun was discussed. Word for word. Devaluation. Hwasong fell silent. On the 3rd day after the publication, a team of prosecutors arrived at Taewa-gun, not to investigate Daniel, to seize documents from Hong's former office, to question the former governor, who had been brought in from Seoul, to inspect the mines. On the 5th day, the prosecutor's office opened a criminal investigation. On the 7th trading day, Hwasong Group's stock fell by 11%. But Daniel didn't celebrate, because construction had come to a standstill. The equipment was gone. The bank was putting pressure on him. The grant was in jeopardy because the ministry had suspended payments pending an investigation. The city that had been growing might come to a halt. And then Daniel did what he had been preparing for half a year, something no one knew about except Lee Ha-eun. The Taewa-gun Residence Fund. 6 months after the population surpassed 40,000, Daniel and Lee Ha-eun had quietly launched a voluntary contribution program. Every resident could contribute between 10 and 50,000 won to the District Development Fund, voluntarily, without coercion, without interest, with a guaranteed refund within 5 years. They didn't advertise it at all. They simply posted the information at the clinic, at the school, at Che Halmoni's cafe, on the bulletin board in the Green Quarter, and people brought their money, quietly, without fanfare. 50,000 won from Grandma Yoon with her bad knees. 30,000 from the old man who was the first to come to Hannah with arthritis. 50,000 from the potters from Daegu. 50,000 from a barista in Seoul. 10,000 from Grandma Che, who said she couldn't give more but didn't want to give less either. By the time Hwasong Group struck, the fund had 480 million won, raised by the residents, 50,000 each. It wasn't enough to complete the industrial park, but it was enough for what mattered most, ensuring the city wouldn't depend on outside funding. Daniel announced the fund at an emergency residence meeting. 800 people showed up. The administration hall could hold 300. The rest stood in the square. Daniel stepped out onto the porch. He said the bank was putting pressure on them, that the equipment was gone, that the enemy was strong, but that the city was alive, and that the 480 million won raised by the residents themselves spoke louder than any bank loan. He didn't give speeches. He spoke in numbers, as always. 480 million would be enough for 3 months of work. In 3 months, the grant would be unfrozen, because the prosecutor's office would confirm that there were no violations. In 3 months, a new contractor would be found to replace Yoon Construction. In 3 months, the city's population would grow by another 5,000 people, and Hwasun Group wouldn't be able to do anything about it. The square was silent. Then, Chehalmoni, small, thin, with a straight back, she raised her hand and said she was contributing another 50,000. After her, Hannah stood up. Another 50. After her, Kim Jong-soo, the police chief. 100,000. After him, Yoon Sang-ho, a former mining foreman. 50. One after another, hand after hand. By the end of the evening, the fund had grown to 520 million. Taewagun became the only district in Korea that didn't depend on banks or corporations, because its residents believed in it, 50,000 won at a time. A year and a half. The storm had passed. The prosecutor's office confirmed that there had been no violations in the use of the grant. Payments resumed. Hwasun Group lost its CEO, who resigned after charges were filed. The former governor of Taewagun testified. 4 managers of Hwasong Mineral Research were arrested. By court order, the land containing rare earth elements was transferred to the county's ownership, completely, without compensation, because the privatization had been carried out in violation of the law. Daniel learned of this decision from a call from the prosecutor. He hung up the phone. He sat there for a minute. 2. 3. Then he stood up. He walked over to the county map, the eastern outskirts, the site of the former mines. Beneath that ground lay between 8 and 12 trillion won. He couldn't wrap his head around that figure. The entire annual budget of Taewagun was 1.5 billion. Buried underground was a sum thousands of times greater. He could have started mining immediately, sold the license, made trillions, built everything, right away, in a year. But he didn't, because he knew how resource booms end. He'd seen it in West Virginia, in Alaska, in dozens of towns that found oil or gas or gold, and 20 years later were left with holes in the ground and empty streets. The resource curse. The money comes too fast. A town grows not because it's attractive, but because it's rich. When the resource runs out, the town dies a second time. And the second time, no one saves it. Daniel created a model that didn't exist in Korea, the Taewa Rare Earth Resources Fund. All revenue from extraction goes into the fund. The fund belongs to the residents. Every registered resident receives a share, not in cash, but in the form of investments in infrastructure, schools, clinics, parks, housing, and roads. The money works for the city, not for individual pockets. In 20 years, when the resource runs out, the city will stand on its own 2 feet, not on the mine, on its people. Lee Ha-eun developed the fund's financial structure in 2 weeks. It was her masterpiece. Triple oversight, independent audits, quarterly report publications, maximum transparency. She presented the model to the county council. Park listened with his mouth agape. In 23 years, he had never seen anything like it. And for the first time in 23 years, he raised his hand and said he agreed. No reservations. The city was changing every week. By the 20th month, the population had reached 78,000. The Taewa Green Industrial Park was up and running. All 24 buildings were fully occupied. There was a 6-month waiting list for tenants. Kate had built a second residential complex without her father's help. using money from the residence fund and a grant. 320 apartments, 90% occupied. She hired 30 workers. She started her own construction company, not a branch of Yoon Construction, her own. She named it Taewa Build. She registered it in Taewa County. When her father found out, he called. She didn't answer the phone. He came in person, in that same black sedan. He found her at the construction site, wearing a hard hat, in work boots, with a walkie-talkie in her hand. They stood facing each other. He was wearing an expensive coat. She was covered in construction dust. He looked at the neighborhood she had built, at the houses with lights on, at the playground Emma had designed, at the trees An Ju-ho had planted along the paths. Her father was silent for a long time. Then he said 2 words. "Daughter, I'm proud of you." Kate didn't cry, but she took off her hard hat and hugged him, for the first time in 5 years. An Ju-ho tactfully turned away and began examining the quality of the masonry on the nearest wall. Grace had received an offer from Seoul's largest newspaper, the position of editor-in-chief of the investigative department, a salary 10 times higher than at Taewa Ilbo. She went to see Daniel. She told him what she was thinking. He asked what she had decided. She replied that she would stay. Not out of loyalty, not out of romance, out of pragmatism. The Taewa Ilbo is her newspaper. She had turned it into the most widely cited regional newspaper in the country. Circulation 7,800. Staff 4 people. Just her. She grew up here, from a reporter no one read to a reporter the whole country follows. Why would she need someone else's newsroom when she has her own? Daniel nodded. He didn't try to persuade her either way. It was her decision, the only right one. Hannah expanded the clinic into a full-fledged hospital. 20 beds, 5 doctors, a pediatric ward, a surgical ward, an internal medicine ward, a 24-hour pharmacy, and a helipad. That very one, the one Daniel had told her about when they first met, back when there was no money. Now there was money, and there was a pad, on the roof, with a red cross visible from the air. Hannah stood on that pad on opening day. She looked down at the city from above, at the houses, at the streets, at the trees, at the people. She remembered her mother, who had died before the ambulance arrived, in a small town, with no hospital, no doctor, no hope. Now there's a hospital in Taewagun. There's a doctor. There's a helicopter that can reach any corner of the county in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. The time her mother didn't live to see. Hannah didn't cry. Doctors don't cry. But she stood on the helipad for a long time, alone, until it started to rain. In the 22nd month, Daniel received an invitation from Seoul, an international conference on urban planning. He was asked to speak before delegates from 30 countries. The topic? The Taewa model. How a dying county became a model of urban renewal. He went. He spoke. Without slides. Without a presentation. He spoke for an hour. About streetlights, about sidewalk tiles, about cans of paint, about 13 children on the school steps, about a grandmother with a rice cake, about a doctor who came because she couldn't help but come, about a journalist who stayed because she found her story, about the girl in a hard hat who built a neighborhood, about the auditor who counted every single one and saved an entire city. The hall was silent. Then they applauded, for a long time. The Minister of Internal Affairs was sitting in the front row, the very same man who had signed Daniel's appointment to Taewagun 2 years ago. After the speech, he approached. He shook his hand and quietly said one sentence. He said the experiment had been a success. Daniel froze. He looked the minister in the eye. He asked, "What experiment?" The minister smiled. He didn't answer. He patted him on the shoulder. Then he walked away. On the flight back, Daniel sat by the window and thought. The experiment was a success. Those words weren't a compliment. They were an admission. The minister knew. He knew who Daniel was. He knew where he came from. He knew that two lives coexisted in the young official's mind. And that meant Daniel wasn't the only one. That somewhere in Korea, there were others, just like him, with two lives, with someone else's knowledge in someone else's bodies, planted in hopeless districts, like seeds in dead soil. 3 years. Morning, October, the same month in which Daniel first opened his eyes in a foreign body in the back seat of an official car. 3 years ago, he was driving along a bumpy road toward a city that didn't exist. Now he was standing on the roof of the new city administration building in Tewasi. Not Tewa-gun, Tewasi. A city. The renaming had been approved by the ministry a month ago. A county with a population of over 200,000 gains city status. The population of Tewasi, as of this morning, 220,412 people. Daniel looked down from the roof and saw a city that hadn't existed 3 years ago. To the west lay Tewaro, the 800 meters where it all began. The maple trees had grown, their canopies closed in over the sidewalk. That very tunnel of leaves he'd imagined when he planted the first tree. 3 years. Trees grow faster than they seem. 22 shops were open on the street. 3 coffee shops, a bakery, a bookstore, a pottery studio that now shipped orders to Seoul and Tokyo. There was a line outside Che Halmoni's cafe every morning. She had expanded the dining area, hired 2 assistants, but she still brewed the coffee and wrapped the rice cakes herself. To the south lay the Green Quarter, 4 pedestrian streets, Emma's Pocket Squares, workshops on the ground floors, windows with balconies on the upper floors, children on bicycles, grandmothers on benches. A woodworker from Chunchun had placed a chair he'd made himself in front of his workshop, and a cat was sitting on it. A ginger cat. No one's cat. Everyone's cat. To the east lies the Tewa Green Industrial Park. 24 buildings, plus 16 new ones built over the past year. 120 companies, 3,000 jobs. The IT cluster, which 3 programmers had started with a single router, now occupied an entire building. 40 employees, contracts with Seoul and Singapore. To the north are the Kate residential neighborhoods. 5 completed, 2 under construction. 1,200 apartments, 4 stories, no taller. Balconies overlooking the mountains. Courtyards with trees. Playgrounds designed by Emma. Tewa Build had become the 3rd largest construction company on the East Coast. Kate hadn't returned to Seoul. The school. Tewa Elementary School with its yellow wall. 218 students. A full teaching staff. A garden at the entrance where the children planted flowers every spring. The marigolds had spread so much that they could be seen from Tewa-ro. The hospital. 20 beds had become 50. 10 doctors. Hannah became the district's chief medical officer. The helipad was operational. Over the past year, there had been 3 emergency evacuations. 3 lives saved in 8 minutes. The newspaper. Tewa Ilbo. Circulation 12,000. Staff of 9. Grace received the National Award for Investigative Journalism of the Year. For Hwason. For the story she unearthed from a room with a single desk and a single computer. The award ceremony was held in Seoul. Grace put on a dress, the only time in 3 years. The next day, she returned to the newsroom. She took off the dress, put on her vintage glasses, and sat down to write her next article. Today was the day of the renaming. A grand ceremony was held in the main square, the very same one where, 3 years ago, there had been an empty parking lot and a dilapidated building with a crack in the wall. Now the square was paved with stone. In the center stood a fountain, the very same fountain that Daniel's enemies had mocked a year and a half ago. Why build a fountain in a poor neighborhood? Around the fountain, 8 cafes and restaurants had opened. Around the fountain. Annual tax revenue from this area amounted to 200 million won. The fountain paid for itself in 4 months. People were standing in the square, lots of them, thousands. The administration had expected 5,000. 15 showed up. They stood in the square, on Tewaro, on the side streets, in the windows, on the balconies. Daniel came down from the roof. He put on a jacket, the very one he draped over a sleeping Lee Ha-eun a year ago. She'd returned it a week later, washed, ironed, without a word. He'd worn it ever since to every important event. She knew. He knew that she knew. Neither of them spoke of it. He stepped out onto the square through the back door. He didn't want to go through the main entrance. He didn't want any attention. His place wasn't on stage. His place was off to the side, by the tree, just like back then, at the school's opening ceremony. Che Hamoni was standing on stage, in a new hanbok. Her son was standing next to her. He had returned 2 years ago. The very same son who had left for Seoul 20 years ago and never called. Daniel had found him through mutual acquaintances. He lived in a basement apartment in Yonsan. He worked as a dishwasher. He drank. He was ashamed. He didn't call his mother because he couldn't bring himself to tell her what he had become. Daniel offered him the position of head chef at the Taewa Culinary School, which had opened a year ago. Not out of pity, because he'd done some digging and found out that 20 years ago, this man had been the top graduate of the culinary college in Busan. Che Haomoni's son had returned. He'd quit drinking. He'd started teaching. His students were working in restaurants all along the East Coast. And every morning, he would come to his mother's cafe. He drank her coffee. She didn't tell him she was proud of him. She just placed an extra rice cake in front of him. He understood. Che Halmoni took the microphone. The square fell silent. She said she'd been living in this place for 30 years, that she'd seen the city come into being, how it died, how it was reborn, that she didn't believe it was possible, that she still doesn't believe it, but the streetlights are on, and the school is open, and her neighbor's grandson is running around the yard instead of riding a bus 30 kilometers away, and her son is standing right next to her. She didn't finish her sentence. She just fell silent. She looked at her son. He took her hand. The square was silent. Then the crowd began to applaud, quietly, and then they applauded louder. The Minister of the Interior had arrived from Seoul, the very same one. He stepped onto the stage. He congratulated the city. He congratulated the residents. He shook Che Halmoni's hand. He stepped down. He walked over to Daniel, who was standing off to the side, by the tree, as always. The minister held out his hand. Daniel shook it. The minister leaned in closer and quietly said what Daniel had been waiting for and dreading to hear. He said, "Congratulations, Mr. Governor. The experiment was a success." Daniel didn't look away. He asked quietly, "How many of us are there?" The minister hesitated. Then he replied, 12, across the country, in 12 districts. Daniel asked if the others had also succeeded. The minister shook his head. 3, including Daniel. 9 didn't make it. Daniel asked what had happened to those 9. The minister replied, "They're gone. Some resigned, some just left. 1 broke down. He couldn't handle 2 lives in one mind." Daniel was silent. 12 people from other worlds, placed in strangers' bodies, sent to hopeless places. The ministry's secret experiment. Can knowledge from another world save what cannot be saved from within? The answer? Sometimes. 3 out of 12. The minister added one more sentence. He said that now Daniel must decide: stay in Tewasi and continue, or accept a new assignment. The ministry is preparing a program based on the Tewa model, 10 new districts. They need someone to lead it. From Seoul. Daniel looked out at the square, at the people, at the fountain, at the trees, at the streetlights that weren't lit yet because it was morning, but would come on in the evening. Everything. Every single thing. He saw Lee Ha-eun. She was standing in the crowd, in a tailored suit, wearing thin framed glasses. She was looking at him. She wasn't smiling, but she was looking. And he knew she was seeing him. Not the governor. Him. He saw Emma. She was holding a baby in her arms. A little girl. The first child born in the revitalized neighborhood. 4 months old. Emma had brought her mother from Los Angeles. Her mother stood nearby. She was looking at the city her daughter had drawn, and which had become a reality. He saw Hannah, in a white lab coat, as always. She stood slightly to the side, just like him. Two people who don't like crowds but came because this day was their day too. He saw Grace, with a camera. She was taking pictures, clicking the shutter, moving through the crowd like a fish in water, capturing faces, moments, light. In a week, one of these photos would appear on the front pages of every newspaper in the country. The square, people, the fountain, and Che Halmoni with her son on stage. The headline, the city that wasn't supposed to be. He saw Kate, wearing a hard hat, even today. She was standing by the unfinished 6th quarter, not in the square, at the construction site, because a construction site doesn't wait for ceremonies. Her father was standing next to her, without a coat, in a work jacket, the one she'd given him. He saw Park. The old accountant was standing at the entrance to the administration building. 26 years. He'd outlasted 7 governors. The 8th turned out to be different. Pak was holding a folder, probably with the quarterly report, because Pak always had a folder in his hands. But he was smiling, just a little, for the first time in the 26 years Daniel had known him. He saw Kim Jong-soo. The police chief was standing at the corner of the square, keeping order, not because he expected trouble, because that's what police officers who love their city do. He saw An Ju-ho, Yoon Sang-ho, Cho Byung-hyun, the workers who had laid the first tiles on Taewa Row 3 years ago. Now they were standing on those very tiles in clean shirts, with their wives, with their children. Daniel looked at it all, at the city he had built. No, that they had built. He hadn't built a city. He had built a place where Chehaomini could have coffee with a friend in the morning, where Hannah could make it to a patient in 8 minutes, where Emma's child could walk to school, where Grace could write the truth and know that people were reading it, where Kate could build houses and know that people would live in them, where Lee Ha-eun could count every won and know that every won goes toward a good cause. They made it work. Everyone made it work. He turned to the minister. He said he would stay. The minister wasn't surprised. He nodded. He left. Daniel stayed by the tree, alone. The square was bustling. People were laughing. Children were running around. Music played from the speakers that Cho Byung-hyun had installed on the poles yesterday. In the evening, the streetlights would come on. All of them. Every single one. And the city would light up. Just like 3 years ago, when he first turned on 312 streetlights and the old man stepped out onto the illuminated street. Only now there were 6,400 streetlights and 220,000 people. And this wasn't a district. It was a city. Daniel took out his notebook. That very one. The first one. The one he'd opened that night on the roof of the administration building. Worn, filled to the last page. He opened the last page. There was room for one line. He wrote, "Bayview is finished." Then he crossed it out. He rewrote it. "The house is built." He closed the notebook, put it in his pocket, and walked into the crowd, toward his people, toward his city, toward his second life, which turned out not to be a punishment, but a second chance.